Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place so extravagantly gilded, so unfathomably ornate. You might honestly wonder if you've accidentally wandered into a Baroque-themed fever dream. You're standing in the early morning light, deep inside the Palace of Versailles. Marble gleams, mirrors stretch wall to wall, and somewhere, echoing down the gold-trimmed corridors, is the rhythmic shuffle of slippers and the gentle hum of powdered conversation. This is the royal dawn routine. Except instead of coffee and emails, it starts with a team of court servants carrying wigs on velvet cushions. At the center of this opulent chaos stands a man known as the Sun King. Louis XIV, ruler of France, wearer of absolutely ludicrous amounts of fabric, and crucially, owner of dozens, yes, dozens, of custom wigs. You're about to spend some serious time with him, not just to marvel at his extremely curated curls, but to truly understand why one monarch would need not one, not five, but 40 wigmakers on permanent retainer. This is history, but not the kind you stay awake for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle quietly into the Hall of Mirrors, careful not to let your shoes squeak on the marble floor. It's just after sunrise, and already, Versailles is pulsing with that particular brand of silent panic that only the French nobility could conjure before breakfast. Courtiers flutter past like startled peacocks, bright, powdered, and smelling faintly of rosewater and desperation. You make your way past a tapestry depicting Louis as Apollo, god of the sun. His face is smooth, symmetrical, unbothered. His curls cascade like a divine waterfall, thick and endless. But here's the funny thing. Underneath that celestial mop of hair, not much going on. See, Louis started losing his hair early. Some historians say as young as 17. Others think it was the stress of ruling a continent-sized ego. Either way, by his early 20s, the king's glorious mane was mostly theater. And so, the wig was reborn. Wigs had been around before, of course. Ancient Egyptians wore them for sun protection. Romans used them for disguise and drama. But it wasn't until Louis, with his empire-sized insecurity, decided to lean all the way in, that wigs went truly viral. And when Louis committed to a bit, he didn't dabble. He revolutionized fashion, created jobs, and turned hair into power. This meant wigs weren't just accessories. They were statements, social armor, metaphors that sat on your head and announced to the world, I am wealthy, powerful, and in no way balding. Inside the palace, you peek into one of the royal dressing rooms. It's not a closet, it's an entire suite. There's an armchair built specifically for sitting during wig fittings. Mirrors positioned to catch every angle. Shelves lined with delicate wig stands shaped like tiny marble busts. Each one holds a different style, the cascade, the ministerial roll, the sunrise coil. Some are trimmed with lace, others powdered until they resemble finely dusted pastries. The servant hurries past you, carrying what looks suspiciously like a small, hairy animal on a tray. You later realize it's the courtier's gesture, a popular half-wig meant to be worn sideways. Allegedly flattering, mostly absurd, and behind it all, pulling invisible strings, are the wigmakers. Up to 40 of them at one time, all bound by contract to the king. Some historians argue it was closer to 35. Others believe as many as 50 were trained over the years, though not all served concurrently. Either way, that's a lot of hair. These weren't your average barbers. They were artisans, engineers of aesthetics. They worked long hours in backlit salons, boiling animal hair, curling locks with heated irons, and perfecting the art of invisible stitching. A master wigmaker could weave hair so seamlessly it would fool even the sharpest-eyed duchess. And they weren't just dealing with human hair. Oh no, horsehair, goat hair, even yak hair imported through shadowy trade routes, which is probably the most luxurious and ridiculous sentence you'll hear tonight. Wigs could weigh several pounds. The truly ceremonial ones came with their own stands and polishing cloths. But here's the kicker. Louis didn't just wear wigs. He curated them. Historians still argue whether he personally chose styles or delegated to trusted advisors, but the consensus remains. His collection was as much about mood as function. On diplomatic days, he'd go for something stately and restrained. On festival days, curls upon glorious, powdered curls. You settle in against a velvet wall tapestry and watch as a young page tries to carry two full-size wigs at once. They're heavy. He wobbles. A powdered curl flops comically over his eye. Somewhere down the hall, a minor noble gasps as she realizes her curls are asymmetrical. And just as you think it can't get any more absurd, a small dog runs past wearing a matching powdered wig. This is Versailles, and you are absolutely not making it through this day with your sanity intact. You follow the powdered dog. It yaps once, indignant, as if it too has suffered the tyranny of Versailles fashion, and you find yourself outside a chamber with sunlight slanting in golden beams. A valet passes carrying a tray not of breakfast, but of ribbon hairpieces, each one labeled for a specific occasion. There's state assembly, cardinal visit, Tuesday chess, and, no joke, one simply marked smolder. Apparently, Louis had moods, and each had its own look. This whole ecosystem of wigs isn't just about hiding baldness. It's about authority. Hair, in this world, is theater. It's armor, status, and sometimes a full-blown personality replacement. If you've got a long, powdered waterfall cascading from your head to your shoulders, you're not just a guy. You're a statement. You're a power structure with legs. You duck into a workshop tucked behind a column and find yourself in the sacred hive of wigcraft. The smell hits first. Beeswax, scorched horsehair, and something vaguely herbal. Inside, dozens of royal wigmakers hunch over tables, looping hair with tiny hooks, boiling curls in copper pots, and muttering things like, "This swan curl will be the death of me," under their breath. There are heated rods lined up like medieval curling irons, cooled stones for setting the shape, and long wooden boxes filled with powdered chalk. White, gray, even lavender, for tinting the final masterpiece. The head wigmaker, a stooped man with eyes permanently squinting from decades of staring at lace fronts, greets you without pausing his work. He's sculpting a new ceremonial piece for the upcoming royal hunt. It's made entirely of twisted ropes of ox hair and, rumor has it, contains a tiny hidden pouch for lavender sachets. Now here's the thing. This isn't just eccentric luxury. The wigs serve a function. In a court obsessed with cleanliness but terrified of water, wigs provided a sort of hygiene workaround. They kept lice off the scalp, sort of. Well, more like they redirected the lice. A good wig, powdered and perfumed, smelled better than most people and didn't require daily washing. So, in a sense, wigs were the dry shampoo of their day. If your dry shampoo was made from goat tails and jealousy, historians still argue whether the rise of wigs actually improved health standards or simply gave the illusion of it. After all, wearing a 7-pound sweat sponge on your head all day couldn't have been great for your pores. But it did create a kind of visible cleanliness. And in Louis's court, appearances were everything. Outside the workshop, you hear the ceremonial bell ring. Time for the king's public rising, or lever. This daily spectacle, in which Louis XIV gets out of bed with an audience, is so carefully choreographed that even the wigs are on a schedule. There's the wig of awakening, used during the first robe fitting, the ministerial curls, worn while hearing morning petitions, and the sovereign cascade, reserved only for the final moment when the king faces the mirror and, at long last, becomes the Sun King. You shuffle along with the crowd toward the royal bedchamber. Courtiers elbow for position, each hoping to catch the king's eye, or at least the shimmer of his curls. This is the courtiers' Olympics, and if your wig isn't powdered correctly, your social prospects might shrivel faster than a parsnip in winter. Here's a fun twist. The style and size of your wig directly communicated your rank. A modest shoulder-length periwig? Probably a mid-tier noble. A two-tiered, lace-edged tower with a pigeon feather tucked just so? That's the Duke of self-importance, and you'd best not block his mirror. The bigger the wig, the higher your rank, or your ambition. Some wigs were so large they required metal understructures to keep them from collapsing. You wonder how many noblemen suffered from what might now be diagnosed as wig-related spinal distress. As you inch closer, you spot a chambermaid gently fluffing one of the king's personal favorites. It's enormous, layered, and just the right amount of absurd. The wigmaker beside her whispers, "This one's called the Versailles Tempest." And yes, you now know that wigs in Louis's day had names. Like ships. Or very spoiled cats. One fringe scholar once suggested, likely half-jokingly, that Louis's wig room may have had its own seasonal rotation. Summer wigs, lighter and cooler, winter wigs with added insulation, spring wigs with floral accents. Historians still argue whether seasonal fashion played any real role, but judging by the existence of mink-lined ceremonial wigs, you'd bet your powdered toupee that it did. The lever begins. Music floats in. The king rises slowly, like a magnificent souffle. His valet secures the first wig, careful not to smudge the powder. You're too far back to see clearly, but the ripple of awe in the room tells you. The curls have landed, and the entire room breathes out in synchronized reverence. You back away from the lever scene, your mind reeling with the theatricality of it all, and follow a lesser-known corridor lined with portraits, each depicting a different Louis, some more curly-headed than others. Your feet find plush carpeting that feels like walking across a field of overfed sheep. Eventually, the hallway opens up into what appears to be a smaller, private salon, where wigs are less about pageantry and more about politics. Here, wigs become weapons in the arsenal of etiquette. Everything in Versailles is a silent duel: status, alliances, ambition, all communicated through silk-lined glances and well-placed hairpieces. You pause by a low table where a nobleman's diary lies open. The ink is still fresh. It reads, "Madame de Montespan's wig was 2 shades lighter today. She's signaling something. Or it's a new powder. Either way, I must respond." This is Versailles. Even your scalp needs a strategy. You ease yourself into a faded velvet armchair and imagine your scalp beginning to itch. Not from lice, hopefully, but from the creeping anxiety of never quite knowing if your curls communicate confidence or cowardice. Beneath every aristocrat's towering hair sat a mind racing through potential slights and coded compliments. Did you bow too low? Did your wig tip too far? Did someone whisper "pigeon's nest" behind your back? You wouldn't be surprised. That was a real insult back then. And in this twisted high society ecosystem, wigmakers are less like tailors and more like secret operatives. The man who pins your curls might also know about your gambling debt or your affair with that opera soprano. Some even say a few wigmakers doubled as informants. Historians still argue whether Louis's wig artisans were tapped by the royal court to spy on their clients. After all, what better place to hear secrets than in someone's dressing room, while fluffing their dignity? One mainstream fact is clear: Louis XIV's reign saw the formalization of fashion as diplomacy. What you wore, particularly on your head, was a political statement. There were unwritten rules, evolving week by week. Show up in last month's lace fringe? You might as well wear dung. Or worse, a simple ponytail. You drift through a side door into what looks like a gallery of mannequin heads. Each is fitted with a different royal wig, preserved under glass domes like ancient relics. One is jet black and coiled like a viper. Another is soft gray, wide as a carriage wheel. You peer closer. Inside one curl, someone's tucked a tiny jeweled pin in the shape of a dolphin. Was that fashion? Or some insider joke among courtiers? The fringe tidbit. There are credible reports that one of Louis's most elaborate wigs, known as the solar spiral, required its own carriage when traveling. It was too delicate and, frankly, too monstrous to ride atop a human head for more than a few paces. The wig had to be presented separately, like a royal relative with travel anxiety. You sit back on a padded bench, imagining that, your hair arriving before you. A servant solemnly announces, "His wig, Your Majesty." And everyone bows. There's even a lingering myth that during one diplomatic visit, a rival monarch was so overwhelmed by the sheer volume and shimmer of Louis's chosen wig that he lost his train of thought mid-negotiation. Historians still argue whether this tale is apocryphal, but it's not hard to imagine. Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a performance art installation that lasted decades. Your eyelids start to droop from all the powder and pomp. A page walks by. Balancing 3 wigs stands stacked like a wedding cake. You hear him mutter, "One for breakfast, one for supper, and one in case of revolution." That last part is probably a joke. Probably. The truth is, France's politics were tangled up in fashion like vines in a topiary maze. The more absurd the wig, the more desperate the wearer was to be seen. And in a palace where a glance from the king could make or break your future, standing out without scandal was a high-stakes game. You recall how some courtiers attempted wig sabotage, discreetly nudging someone's curls askew, or whispering to a maid to fluff them just a touch too high. Scandalous? Yes. Common? Also yes. And if your wig was too tall, you might be asked to remove it in church, or risk brushing soot from the chandelier into your face mid-prayer. It's all maddening, and yet deeply effective. The palace is quieter now, the footfalls fewer, the air soft with the scent of rose water and old cedar floors. You pass a forgotten salon where an unused wig rests on a stand. It's blonde, curled tightly, and has a silk ribbon tied in a bow. A tag dangles from its edge, Louis, garden version. Apparently, even the king had casual looks. You step softly past the garden version, wig like it might wake up and demand a ball. The corridors narrow again, funneling you into what appears to be a long-forgotten archive. The air smells like parchment and talcum. Shelves groan under the weight of carefully folded lace, faded design sketches, and bundles of hair tied with ribbon. You spot a small velvet pouch labeled horsehair, Hungarian, summer batch. That's right. You're officially in the wig ingredient pantry now. And this is where things start to tangle, both literally and historically. You ease open a narrow drawer and find a tuft of wiry black curls, suspiciously springy. This one is labeled goat. Yes, goat. Because in Louis XIV's day, a proper wig wasn't just a hairpiece. It was an architectural project requiring animal input, strategic engineering, and alarming amounts of powder. Mainstream fact incoming. Most wigs of the time were made from human hair, but shortages and rampant lice led to creative alternatives. Horsehair was a favorite. It held shape beautifully, especially when molded into those towering ringlets. Goat hair added volume, and yak was considered a luxury import, though historians still argue whether powdered yak wigs were widely adopted or just an expensive novelty for royals who'd already bought everything else. But here's your quirky tidbit for the night. There are reports, admittedly spotty, that one particularly vain courtier paid extra for hair harvested from the tails of Venetian opera singers. Why tails, you ask? Because the singers allegedly grew their hair long for dramatic effect, and only the performance-grown sections were deemed emotionally resonant enough for wig crafting. Can you imagine the auction? This strand saw 3 curtain calls and a standing ovation. You chuckle, or maybe yawn. Hard to tell at this hour. Back in the wig workshop, apprentices, young boys usually, were trained to sort, clean, boil, and comb the hair. Think of them as 17th century junior stylists, only with fewer breaks and more exposure to animal fat. You wander past a shelf stacked with empty powder jars. Labels read like a dessert menu. Lily, lavender, cinnamon, crushed violet. It wasn't just about aesthetics. Perfumed powder masked the, let's say, organic scent of aged wigs, which, if you wore one daily, could get pretty alarming during a summer in Versailles. The wigs, when finished, didn't simply sit quietly. No, they had names. Personalities, even. There was the Cascade, the Royal Bluff, and, no joke, the Thunder. You can picture it now. Louis sauntering down the hall of mirrors in a swirling gray confection called the Thunder, his curls bouncing with the confidence of a man whose hair has diplomatic immunity. You trail your fingers along a tabletop where someone once drew diagrams, tiny ink sketches of wigs seen from the side, the front, the heavens. One sketch includes a side note. Weight equals 6.4 pounds. Subject fainted after dinner. Perhaps not the most wearable fashion statement. Still, beauty is pain, or at least a mild neck injury. And then, the fringe twist. Some courtiers began including hidden pockets in their wigs, tiny compartments where they'd stash scented cloths, notes, or even miniature snuff boxes. Think of it as early wearable tech, minus the battery and with more powdery explosions. Historians still argue whether Louis himself indulged in secret wig pocketing or found the idea vulgar. But many agree that wig-based smuggling was real enough to merit occasional searches at palace entrances. You pause beside a small brazier that once warmed hair tongs. A heavy iron tool rests nearby, shaped like oversized tweezers. That was used for curling. The more intricate the swirl, the more prestige it conveyed. If your wig drooped mid-court audience, you could lose face. Literally. Some nobles brought backup wigs for high-pressure occasions, like state dinners or marriage proposals. Just imagine proposing while your hair collapses like a souffle. Not ideal. And here's a historical echo for your ASMR-sensitized ears. Wig maintenance wasn't silent. It was full of sizzles, snips, and the occasional yelp when hot tongs met inattentive fingers. In fact, there's one surviving record of a valet yelling fire, only to be told calmly by the duke he served, "No, Jean. That's just ambition leaving the ends." Dry humor, even in powdered times. Your eyes start to feel sandy as you sit on a low bench surrounded by dismembered mannequin heads and faux ringlets. The air hangs heavy with lavender-scented dust. You watch as an imaginary wigmaker brushes one final curl into place before whispering, "Voila, fit for a king," or at least a well-positioned marquis. It strikes you that this whole wig thing, it wasn't just fashion. It was armor, a mask, a competitive sport with tight curls and tighter rules. And Louis, ever the maestro, knew exactly how to wield it. He didn't just hire 40 wigmakers for fun. He built a hair empire, one carefully pinned curl at a time. You rise from the dusty bench, careful not to disturb the scattered curls at your feet, and make your way down a narrow hallway lined with portraits, each more dramatic than the last. They all seem to stare at your head, judging its bare, unpowdered humility. You begin to understand. In the court of Louis XIV, the wig wasn't an accessory, it was an identity. An identity had rules. Tonight, you find yourself in the wig protocol chamber. Not officially, of course, but the spirit of bureaucracy hums in the walls. This was where the rituals of hair hierarchy were born. Yes, there were protocols for wig wearing, strict, elaborate, sometimes absurd. Here comes your mainstream fact. In Louis's court, the size, shape, and placement of your wig often indicated your rank. The taller the wig, the higher your status. But even that had layers. There were full-bottomed wigs, towering periwigs, campaign wigs for travel, and simplified versions called bob wigs for more casual affairs, if such a thing existed at Versailles. Now for the fun bit. Wigs weren't just worn, they were presented. When visiting the king, one was expected to remove the outer hat, reveal the full splendor of their coiffure, and bow in a particular rhythm so the curls cascaded just so. If your wig jiggled out of sync, well, it might not spark a scandal, but it would earn a smirk. And in Versailles, that was social death. You tiptoe past a display of ceremonial wig stands, some carved from ivory, others painted gold. One has a velvet nameplate for Thursday banquets. Another simply reads, "Hunting formal." It's not just a closet, it's a calendar. Quirky tidbit time. One ambitious duke once commissioned a wig so wide it allegedly brushed both sides of a double doorway as he walked through. This wasn't a prank, it was a statement. A movable monument to ego and social aspiration. Court painters even had to adapt, widening their portraits to accommodate such follicular bravado. Somewhere in France today, there's probably a hallway still stained with lavender powder from that very wig. And let's not forget the pageantry of the Lever, Louis XIV's waking ceremony. You lean into this memory now, cozy and slightly amused. Each morning, as the sun rose, select nobles were allowed into the king's chamber to watch him get ready. We're talking velvet dressing gowns, scented oils, a gold chamber pot cameo, real morning glamour. But the highlight? The ceremonial selection of the day's wig. Yes, the king had dozens to choose from. Historians still argue whether the choice was strategic, aligned with his mood or message, or simply dictated by the weather and curl resistance. One observer recorded how Louis sometimes delayed the entire court's schedule debating between the auburn cloud and the evening cascade. It might sound petty, but remember, when your very image is statecraft, every curl matters. You can't help but imagine the advisors waiting outside, scrolls in hand, whispering about treaties and tariffs while Louis stands before a gilded mirror, frowning at a slightly misaligned ringlet. It's the ultimate example of politics via aesthetics. If the Sun King's hair radiated confidence, the court followed suit. If he chose a demure style, nobles interpreted it as restraint or illness, or maybe a fashion pivot. "Did you see?" they'd murmur. "Low-volume curls today. Something's afoot." There's a term for this, symbolic authority. Louis's wigs were a language, an entire dialect of dominance. The more elaborate the hair, the more unreachable he seemed. It wasn't enough to be powerful. He had to look cosmically unapproachable. And what better way than with a synthetic solar flare of goat hair and powdered stardust? Now here's your scholarly wrinkle for the evening. Some historians claim that Louis's obsession with wigs intensified after he began losing his own hair in his 20s, thanks to either illness or stress. Others argue it was never about personal loss, but about absolute control over every visible part of the king's image. Either way, by mid-reign, the wigs had become more than a solution. They were doctrine. As you stand beneath a dim chandelier dusted with what you hope is only cobwebs, you glance at a ledger left on a pedestal. It records wig appointments, times, names, even notes like curl height unsatisfactory and too somber for Tuesday. A crossed-out entry reads, Moss blonde, discontinued after Duchess incident. No context, just mystery and moose. You smile, sleep tugging at the corners of your thoughts. There's something oddly soothing about a world where social peril hinged on the tightness of a ringlet. Before leaving the protocol chamber, you spot a final oddity, a carved sign in Old French. You squint to interpret it. Roughly translated, it reads, All curls must defer to the crown. Literal or not, it feels oddly comforting, so you tip your imaginary wig to the velvet shadows and shuffle onward, deeper into the court's bouffant abyss. Your slippers scuff gently across the marble tiles, each step echoing faintly through a gallery that smells faintly of lavender, must, and ancient starch. Somewhere far behind you, the imagined swish of silk and the rustle of stiff crinoline rustles into stillness. Ahead lies the real workshop of the Sun King's follicular fantasies, the royal wigmaker's chambers. If Versailles had a heartbeat, you suspect this might be it, pulsing quietly beneath the golden glass with the steady thrum of scissors snipping and pomade pots clinking. You step into the room slowly, as if you might interrupt a sacred rite. The air is thick with powdered air and the soft static of static cling curls. Let's start with your mainstream fact. Louis XIV officially employed at least 40 wigmakers to serve him and his court. But the number only tells part of the story. These weren't just stylists. They were engineers of appearance, dreamers in horsehair and linen, fabricators of dignity. And they worked constantly. Wigs had to be cleaned, repaired, perfumed, repowdered, and occasionally exorcised of small insects who refused to respect royal boundaries. Some were on call around the clock. If the king's wig lost volume during an especially animated conversation, someone was expected to refresh it before the end of the hour. You pause beside a wooden workbench, one leg slightly shorter than the others, and run your finger across a row of curled samples. Chestnut, ash, ivory, even a strand dyed with indigo that must have been an experiment or a dare. Each curl is perfectly coiled, like a tiny frozen question mark. And now, for your nightly fringe fact. One of the most prized wig ingredients was yak belly hair. Yes, from the underbelly of Tibetan yaks. It had a natural softness and bounce, apparently unmatched by local options. A few select wig makers even specialized in it, and one scandal broke when a foreign bounce was spotted atop a duke's head during a diplomatic audience. The king reportedly noticed, and his silence said everything. Historians still argue whether Louis himself favored yak wigs, you murmur in the hush, or whether those were reserved for nobility trying to outflaunt one another. In any case, yak hair had to be smuggled in delicate rolls, washed in rose water, and dried by candle warmth, not flame. It caught fire too easily, and nothing kills a soiree like spontaneous combustion. You edge closer to a diagram on the wall, a labeled sketch of a periwig in cross-section. Arrows point to powder core, silk thread seam, and something called the dominance crest, apparently a raised section at the very top, designed to assert height in salons with low ceilings. Because why have a crown when your curls can do the talking? The room is quiet now, but you can imagine the chaos that once pulsed here. Apprentices carting armfuls of fresh horsehair through the doors, senior stylists measuring temple-to-temple width for each noble, arguing about optimal curl tightness for candlelit events. You imagine one muttering, "Too tight," and he looks anxious. "Too loose," and it's practically treason. A silk ledger on a side table catches your eye. You open it gently and find the name of every noble scheduled for wig fittings that month, along with notes in maddeningly loopy cursive. One entry reads, Viscount Gregoire, requested 17 ringlet count. Approved. Caution, forehead sheen. Another says, Madame de Lamotte, allergic to bergamot powder. Substitute talc. And then, another gem of eccentricity, a small drawing of a rabbit in a powdered wig. No name, no explanation, just a smug bunny looking fabulous. You chuckle softly. Sleepy history has its own inside jokes, and just as your mind begins to drift, a new image forms. An entire servant whose job it was to carry a wig fan. Yes, a fan just for the wig. To keep it fluffed in hot weather, to ensure the powder stayed dry, to offer a breeze of superiority when necessary. One was even designed with a little mirror on the handle so nobles could admire their curls in passing. Historians still argue whether these fans were ever weaponized during arguments. You joke to yourself, but if any object could incite a duel at Versailles, this was it. You make your way to the far end of the room where a mannequin head sits alone on a pedestal, topped with the grandest wig yet. It's colossal, a swirling tower of ash-blonde curls, laced with golden thread and studded with what appears to be tiny pearls. A card beneath it reads, Le Triomphe du Roi, the triumph of the king. You lean in close and feel, for just a second, a strange kinship with the anonymous artisan who crafted it. Fingers aching, eyes red from candlelight, knowing the final creation would grace a head that ruled continents. Imagine putting that much work into a hairstyle only to watch it toppled by an unexpected sneeze. And that's the great absurdity, isn't it? Beneath all the pomp and fragrance, these wigs were fragile, vulnerable. They had to be constantly fixed, pinned, powdered, and respected. Like the monarchy itself, they projected power but demanded constant upkeep. You turn away and feel the softest ghost of a draft. Maybe it's your imagination. Or maybe it's the sigh of a wigmaker, centuries gone, still frustrated that someone combed the curls counterclockwise. Either way, you know now. Behind every royal image was an army of silent artists, holding scissors instead of scepters. You wander farther into Versailles, your soft footfalls swallowed by the velvety hush of ancient tapestries. Your fingers graze the gilded banister of a staircase, cool and unervingly smooth, like it's been polished not by cloth, but by centuries of gossip. The air shifts again, just faintly now, and you begin to sense the presence of someone who's always nearby yet never truly seen. The valet de chambre. This, you realize, is where the wigs stop being mere fashion and become full-blown ceremony. Your mainstream historical fact? Louis XIV's daily dressing ritual, known as the lever, was a carefully staged performance involving dozens of courtiers, attendants, and yes, wigmakers. Everything from handing the king his undershirt to securing his curls was choreographed with theatrical precision. But this wasn't just about hygiene or routine. It was a form of power projection. You, standing invisible beside his valet, can almost hear the rustle of silk stockings as nobles elbow each other for proximity, hoping for even a nod. You imagine Louis sitting regally still, arms outstretched slightly, while someone gently plops a carefully curated wig onto his head like a cherry on a very sweaty Sunday that a valet steps forward in your mind's eye, lifting one wig with gloved hands. It's massive, towering curls that would make any drag queen blush. A single misplaced curl could ruin the morning's symmetry and possibly someone's career. Now your fringe fact. Some wigs were scented with cinnamon or vanilla to mask the less royal odors that built up over time. The king, not known for excessive bathing, relied heavily on perfume and powder. One report suggests that a wig could hold the scent of nutmeg for over a week if properly baked under a warming dome. Picture that, baked wigs. The Great French Bake-Off. Minus the croissants as you lean against an imaginary bureau. You think about the elaborate game of social hierarchy behind every strand. The king had first choice of wigs, of course, but others followed based on rank, favor, and royal whim. And it wasn't just about style. The volume of your curls could dictate the volume of your voice at court. Too modest a wig, you'd be practically invisible. Too flamboyant, you might be whispered about in salons, or worse, mistaken for Italian. You recall one document, a courtier's diary, scribbled hastily during the summer of 1677, mentioning a moment of scandal where a duke accidentally wore a wig intended for the dauphin. Historians still argue whether it was a genuine mistake or a subtle bid for influence. You whisper. Either way, the wig was quietly switched at supper, and the duke mysteriously stopped being invited to tennis. Your gaze lingers on a velvet-lined drawer filled with wig combs, each one tagged with a noble's name. Some are carved with ivory, others with simple polished wood. One has tiny rubies embedded along the spine. Impractical, but undeniably impressive. You lift it gently in your imagination, feeling the ridiculous weight of beauty politics. Beyond the drawer sits a glass display case. Of course, in your sleepy dream version of Versailles, the curators have kindly left it open for you. Inside, pinned like delicate butterflies, are dozens of powdered curls. Each curl a different texture, color, and size. There's something oddly touching about them, like they're trophies from a vanished war of vanity. And just as you start to drift in thought, your brain serves up another trivia treat. There was a brief wig-related fad involving tiny model ships woven into the hair. Yes, little galleons, with sails, perched triumphantly among the curls like seagulls on a particularly frilly buoy. A duchess once wore one to celebrate a naval victory, only for her ship to slowly tilt forward during dinner and sink into her soup. You smile softly. Sleep is curling around you now, like a gentle nap inside a periwig. But you keep floating with the thread of thought. You picture a young valet in training, nervously practicing his wig-lifting technique on a stuffed mannequin. His mentor watches, arms crossed, correcting posture like it's ballet. Lift with the knees. The knees. Historians still argue whether wig lifting had its own official court etiquette. You add, letting your voice drop to a whisper. But knowing Versailles? Probably yes. There were rules for folding napkins. After all, you imagine the daily wig meeting, a hushed morning gathering of wigmakers and stylists, each one presenting the day's options like auctioneers. Today, the king favors gravitas. We'll need height, solemnity, and a touch of weather resilience. It might rain. One junior stylist whispers, "How about the ashen spiral with the modest plume?" There's a beat of tension. Then a senior nods. "Acceptable. Light on the vanilla powder, though." Last week's hawk sneezed. Even wigs, you realize, had their seasons. In winter, darker tones, heavier builds. Summer, powdered, lighter, more breathable. You can almost hear one courtier mutter, "Ah, the breathable wig. Revolutionary." And yet, you nod sympathetically, because who wouldn't want air-conditioned curls in the Paris heat? Your final stop is the king's mirrored chamber. You step inside and see reflections of wigs upon wigs upon wigs. You in a powdered bob. You in an elaborate top-heavy monstrosity that defies gravity. You in something resembling a feather duster on a bad hair day. It's absurd. It's glorious. It's Versailles. And it all hinged on a single idea. That hair, even fake hair, could be a form of divine right. You slip through another velvet-curtained doorway, your fingers grazing the silk as you go, and the corridor opens into a long gallery filled with the scent of powder, rosewater, and something faintly musty, perhaps the memory of too many powdered heads crammed into too little space. This was where courtiers loitered, plotted, and, yes, panicked about their hair, because now you've reached the era of peak wig anxiety. The court of Louis XIV had reached an almost comical level of tonsorial obsession. For the well-heeled noble, the question wasn't whether to wear a wig, but what kind, how large, how curled, and whether it was too last season. Fashion didn't just matter. It could make or break your standing. The mainstream historical fact? In the latter decades of his reign, Louis XIV's personal style dictated every aspect of fashion in France and beyond. His signature long, flowing, and elaborately curled wig, often dark brown or black, became the gold standard. So much so that dozens of other European monarchs and nobles began imitating it, turning Louis's personal vanity into a continental export. You pause beside a display of wig sketches. Yes, they existed, delicate ink and charcoal portraits of prototype hairstyles submitted to the royal court for approval. Some are towering cones of curls. Others are fanned out like waterfalls. One, suspiciously, resembles a mushroom. You squint. Yep, definitely a mushroom. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some nobles grew so obsessed with staying ahead of wig trends that they employed private wig scouts, stylists or servants sent to Versailles or even Paris to spy on what leading courtiers were wearing. If the curls had shifted 2 inches upward, you'd better know before breakfast or risk social ruin by lunch. And then there was the powder. Wigs were almost never worn in their natural color. Instead, they were powdered with blends of rice flour or starch mixed with colored tints: white, gray, lavender, and even pale blue. The powder was applied liberally, often with large bellows or puffs. In a rush, just walk through the cloud left behind by someone else. Think of it like the dry shampoo aisle in a hurricane. You duck behind a column as a vision of a noblewoman glides by, her wig nearly brushing the chandelier. It's hard to tell where the curls end and the accessories begin. Ribbons, pearls, feathers. At one point, someone even tried small taxidermied birds. Yes, real ones. Historians still argue whether the infamous Cardinal's Finch coiffure was ever worn outside a masquerade. You whisper, half horrified, half impressed, and then you remember the tragic consequence of this extravagance: head lice. A genuine concern when you're wearing animal hair wigs baked under powdered perfume for days at a time. People would scratch discreetly, or, when alone, remove the wig and rake through it with a special lice fork, a thin metal comb that resembles a medieval torture device. If torture devices came in mother-of-pearl. One anecdote recounts a particularly smug duke who bragged that his wig was so clean it could host a luncheon. Minutes later, a tiny beetle crawled down his collar mid-toast. The Duchess fainted. The cake was untouched. Your shoes click gently against the polished wood as you move into another chamber. This one quieter, lit by late afternoon sun streaming through high windows. You feel as if you're inside the very scalp of French nobility, each curl a strand of status. And not all status was equal. Wigs had names. Styles like the Cadogan, the bagwig, and the Ramillies offered subtle cues about their wearer's politics, military experience, or literary leanings. The full-bottomed wig, massive and sweeping like an avalanche of curls, was a favorite among judges, so much so that it became synonymous with legal authority. Imagine sentencing someone while wearing 3 pounds of baked horsehair. It adds drama. You pause beside a portrait of Louis himself, stiff and dazzling, his expression somewhere between bored and imperial. His wig cascades down both shoulders like a curtain. You wonder if he could even hear properly under that much fluff. Maybe that's why he ignored court petitions, selective hearing via hair insulation. And then, softly, comes the sound of snipping. A young wigmaker, imagined again by your sleepy mind, trims the edge of a freshly curled masterpiece. He hums to himself, carefully shaping the loops. It's an art form, not unlike topiary. One wrong move, and the entire silhouette changes. You can almost hear him muttering, "Too much bounce and he'll look like a Spanish musketeer." Historians still argue whether wigmakers were allowed to sign their creations. You murmur. Some claim tiny labels were hidden beneath the base. Others dismiss it as myth. But given how fiercely style was protected, you wouldn't be surprised. Outside the window, the gardens ripple in the breeze, a sea of hedges and flowers that mimics, in its own way, the sculpted symmetry of a well-made wig. There's a strange comfort in that thought, that everything at Versailles, from hair to hedgerows, was built on the same principle: look good or go home. And not just look good. Look timeless, immortal, unbothered by sweat, seasons, or lice infestations. That was the Versailles way. As your eyes grow heavier, your feet slow, and you stand in the powdery silence of the gallery, remembering how much effort went into something so deeply artificial. Yet behind every curl, a strategy. Beneath every feather, a fear of irrelevance. All of it, carefully powdered and pinned, just for the chance to be seen by a man who wore the sun as his symbol, and maybe forgot your name 5 minutes later. You drift slowly out of the powder-scented corridor and find yourself in a narrower wing of the palace, where the walls are lined with gilded mirrors and the muffled echo of slippers seems to whisper secrets from centuries ago. This is where the behind-the-scenes drama unfolded, where the people responsible for all that hair magic lived, worked, and, occasionally, wept into their wig powder. Now, about those 40 royal wigmakers on retainer. It wasn't just for fun. Louis XIV didn't keep that many artisans around just to watch curls bounce. Each one had a role, a specialty, and an unspoken terror of being the next to fall out of favor. You imagine them lining up at dawn, each cradling a masterpiece in progress, hoping today was the day the king chose their work. The mainstream historical fact, the position of royal wigmaker, or Perruquier du Roi, was highly prestigious and fiercely competitive. The most favored among them were granted apartments at Versailles, access to the royal dressing room, and stipends that would make even a modern-day influencer weep with envy. It was not uncommon for a single wig to take weeks to craft, curl by curl, stitched over linen and padded horsehair. You peek into a ghostly recreation of a wigmaker's workshop. Long work tables stretch out before you, dotted with hot curling irons, pig bristle brushes, and tiny silver tools that look suspiciously like dental instruments. Behind the tools lie shelves stacked with powdered hair, human and animal. Horsehair for body, goat hair for softness, human hair for realism. Rumors swirled that some wigmakers paid well for freshly shorn tresses from Parisian prisoners. Here's your quirky tidbit. One wigmaker, apparently fed up with sourcing good quality hair, raised his own small herd of white goats on a rooftop in Paris. His neighbors thought he was insane, until he landed a contract with the Queen's cousin. Historians still argue whether wigmakers used musical curls. You think as you run a finger along a delicate metal curling form. These were ringlets supposedly shaped to mimic the visual rhythm of musical scales, an auditory concept translated into coiffure. Was it fashion whimsy or just poetic marketing? No one knows for sure. And yet, all of this was deadly serious at court. A single poorly styled wig could result in scandal. It wasn't just hair, it was reputation, rank, and sometimes even rumor. If the king was displeased with your wig, too short, too puffy, too Dutch, you might find yourself banished from court quicker than a molting parrot. But oh, when a wig was perfect, when it shimmered under the candlelight and framed the royal jaw just right, it was a moment of true courtly triumph. And it took an army to get there. The master wigmakers often had apprentices, journeymen, and young boys who powdered, stitched, combed, and swept in hushed reverence. You pass a faded scrap of parchment tacked above a wooden workbench. It's a set of wig orders from an unnamed noble. 6 entries for the week. 1 ceremonial, 1 hunting, 1 dinner length, 2 backups, and 1 for sentimental mood. What even is a sentimental mood wig? You picture cascading waves with a strategically placed silk ribbon. Or maybe something that holds a lock of a lover's hair, braided secretly into the base. Romantic. Unhygienic. Classic Versailles. One Wigmaker's journal from 1697, recounted in letters, describes a near brawl when 2 rival stylists accused each other of stealing ringlet patterns. The dispute had to be mediated by a chamberlain and nearly led to dueling combs at dawn. You can almost hear the soundtrack now. Slow, dramatic violin, and a powder puff slapping the floor like a dropped glove. You step into the next room, a chamber devoted to the king's personal dressing ritual, lull du Roi. It was more than just getting out of bed. It was a daily spectacle where dozens of nobles were granted the honor of watching Louis get dressed. And yes, that included his wig fitting. Every morning, each stage of the ritual had its appointed attendants. The first valet held the shirt, the next tied the garters, and the perruquier stepped forward with the day's chosen wig, often assisted by a small crew with brushes, ribbons, and powder bellows. The king stood still, a living statue of statecraft, while his identity was literally placed on his head. Historians still argue whether Louis ever reused a wig. You whisper, amused. Some say he had new ones crafted weekly. Others claim he kept a rotation, each with coated embroidery inside the lining. Either way, one thing's clear. He didn't just wear wigs. He weaponized them. You pause by a panel describing how wigmakers had to adapt their designs seasonally. Summer styles were lighter, less dense, and sometimes incorporated lace nets for ventilation. In winter, curls grew thicker, sometimes doubling as makeshift earmuffs. One hilarious trend involved integrating tiny sachets of herbs into the wig's structure to ward off lice and, presumably, bad vibes. Then there's the curious case of the accident wig. This was a backup worn only in emergencies, such as spontaneous rainfall, fainting spells, or, heaven forbid, candle wax mishaps. Because nothing said disgrace like a melted curl mid-audience, you walk toward the window, where sunlight casts warm halos across the parquet floor. It's hard not to feel a strange respect for the royal wigmakers. They were artists, therapists, engineers, even part-time spies. And for all the grandeur of the court, their work rarely earned a public name. No signature, no plaque, Just the knowledge that a perfect wig might buy you another week of relevance. Point one final display catches your eye. A silver-handled comb engraved with initials no one can identify. It's worn smooth, the teeth slightly bent. Someone used it every day? Someone who likely measured their success in satisfied glances and whispered envy. You blink slowly, eyelids heavy now, and wonder what it must have been like to craft beauty that was never truly yours. To brush, curl, sculpt, and fade quietly into the background, like powdered mist drifting down a Versailles hallway. The hush of the workroom fades as you continue down a corridor lined with aged portraits. Not of kings or queens, but of courtiers. So many faces framed in curls, spirals, and cascades of impossible hair. The further you go, the higher the wigs seem to grow, as though each decade inflated the hairstyles just a little more with ego and competitive flair. You're heading deeper now, not just into the palace, but into the psychology behind it all, because at some point, this wasn't just about fashion or even hygiene. It became theater, identity, power made manifest in powdered ringlets. You stop before a particularly dramatic painting of a noble woman whose hairdo appears to contain an entire naval battle, complete with a tiny ship rigged in full sail, perched atop her head like a proud, ridiculous crown. Here's your historical fact. In the late 18th century, the towering pouf coiffure became a favorite among aristocratic women, particularly at the French court. These weren't just hairstyles. They were sculptural statements, often themed to reflect a personal achievement, a political stance, or a passing obsession. One woman supposedly wore a hairstyle depicting her fiancé's ship returning from sea. Another sported a replica of the Bastille. That one didn't age well. Of course, you're still in the era of Louis XIV, where the wig hadn't yet reached vertical absurdity, but the seed was there. And the men? Not to be outdone, they crafted elaborate puffs and curls that emphasized masculinity in the weirdest way possible. By covering up their scalps with hair from someone else's head, shaped like a cloud and doused in starch, a fringe detail to tickle your brain. Some noblemen had secret wig pockets sewn into their coats, so if a wig emergency struck during a soiree, say, a drunken cousin tugged too hard, or a chandelier fell, they could duck into a hallway and swap it out discreetly. Fashion insurance, 17th century edition. And here comes the eyebrow raiser. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV's most iconic wigs were actually designed in-house or imported from specialist ateliers in Italy. Some scholars point to trade records and letters between the court and Neapolitan artisans. Others insist that Versailles maintained a strict policy of French-made finery. It's one of those oddly passionate debates that could fill an academic conference, and probably has. You lean closer to a diagram pinned to a nearby velvet-paneled display, the anatomy of a court wig. It shows each labeled section: base netting, padding zones, major curls, outer spirals, powder traps. It reads like a blueprint for a skyscraper. A mini engineering marvel, held together with thread, beeswax, and the desperate ambition of its creator. You can't help but wonder, what did it feel like to wear one? Heavy? Definitely. The average court wig could weigh between 2 and 5 pounds, depending on how much padding and ornamentation was involved. You imagine the pressure on the neck, the cautious movements, the impossibility of scratching your scalp without causing a court scandal. Some poor soul even wrote in his diary about how his court wig gave him frequent headaches, but he wore it anyway. To go without was social suicide. After all, the bigger the wig, the bigger the deal you were. In every sense, let's not forget the politics behind the curls. Louis XIV wielded fashion as policy. In fact, wigs were part of the visual hierarchy of court life. The length and fullness of your wig could say more about your status than your words ever could. The king's own perukes, especially the full-bottomed ones, became symbols of royal might. Like little fortresses of follicles, even the color mattered. White or pale gray, respectable, often powdered into submission. Darker hues? Younger men trying to show off their virility and vigor. Red? Now that was scandalous, more often associated with actors or, less reputable professions. And then there's the phenomenon of wig envy. Yes, a real thing. Letters between courtiers reveal passive-aggressive compliments like, "Such noble curls today, Your Grace." One could almost mistake you for the sun himself. Which sounds nice, until you realized the Sun King was the benchmark, and anything almost was just short of divine. And yet, even amidst the snobbery and stiff necks, the wigs did something quietly revolutionary. They created a visual sameness that leveled the field, at least on the surface. Bald, gray-haired, patchy scalp from who knows what. No matter. Under a wig, everyone started from the same fluffy baseline. There's something oddly democratic about that. In a roundabout, totally not democratic at all monarchy kind of way. You pass an engraving of a younger noble, caught mid-laugh at a banquet, wine goblet in hand, and curls bouncing as he leans back. The caption simply reads, "To laugh is to dislodge powder." Someone took their job very seriously. Next to it is a curious artifact, a wig stand shaped like a bust, its nose broken and one eye askew. It once held the crown jewel of the Marquis de Montfleur's collection, a wig reportedly so lifelike, a falcon once tried to land on it during a hunt. You chuckle, and then stifle a yawn. The pacing of your steps slows. The air smells faintly of lavender and starch, as if the room itself remembers its powdered past, and now you begin to understand the pressure, not just on the neck, but on the ego. One didn't simply wear a wig. One performed it, maintained it, let it whisper your worth from across the salon. The stakes were absurdly high for something that could be knocked askew by a stiff breeze. But then again, in a world where your worth was measured by proximity to royal favor, a single stray curl could be the difference between triumph and tragedy. Your fingers trail across a final plaque that reads, "Hair may grow from the head, but power descends from the crown." And you're not sure if they meant the monarchy or the wig. Maybe both. The hallway turns sharply to the left, as if trying to usher you into a new realm, one where hair becomes currency, and social mobility depends not on birth or brilliance, but on how convincingly you can carry a literal tower of someone else's locks on your head. You cross the threshold into the perruquier's studio, a long, lamplit space that still faintly smells of pomade, wax, and disappointment. Here's the real kicker. Louis XIV didn't just have one or two personal wigmakers. He had over 40 royal wigmakers on retainer. 40. That's nearly a football team's worth of people, all dedicated to the cultivation and maintenance of synthetic splendor for one man's head. Each wigmaker had a specialty. One was known for volume, another for curl retention, another for powder finesse. There were rumors that one man had mastered the art of weatherproofing wigs with goose grease and brandy. It smelled terrible, but it held up in the rain. The mainstream fact lands with a soft thud. The sheer size of Louis's wig core was unprecedented. Prior monarchs had hairstylists, sure, but this was industrialized follicle management. An operation so complex, it required ledgers, inventories, and daily coordination. There was even a kind of early HR system. Apprentices would work their way up from washing and carding the hair to styling and eventually designing new shapes, curls, and layers. Some of them wrote treatises on the geometry of hair. One particularly ambitious soul wrote a 200-page thesis comparing wig structures to cathedral domes. It was rejected for being too ecclesiastical. Historians still argue whether the number, 40, was symbolic, inflated for grandeur, or quite literal. Some say it matched the 40 musketeers. Others insist it corresponded to the number of styles in the royal rotation. Yet others believe Louis just liked the number. It felt kingly. 40 men serve my hair is a very specific power flex. Your feet carry you past tall cabinets filled with mannequin heads, each one labeled with a name, a date, and a mood. Festivite 1674, Parliament Grey, Nocturne Hunting Set. Like an absurd little library of egos. Some wigs are elaborate monstrosities bristling with silk ribbon and lace, while others are surprisingly modest, with neat rows of curled side pieces and a tapered ponytail. One of them, marked confessional, has a built-in flap designed for leaning forward without dislodging the powder. You lean close and catch the shimmer of embedded mica dust in one of the more extravagant styles. Yes, mica, as in sparkly rocks. Some courtiers paid extra to have their wigs glisten under candlelight like celestial beings. Imagine having hair so blinding it required guests to squint. Perhaps that was the point. A visual migraine of superiority. Now, here's a fringe nugget to savor. One of Louis XIV's more eccentric wigmakers, Monsieur La Fontaine, reportedly used music to style his wigs. He would play harpsichord pieces while curling and shaping, claiming that specific Baroque rhythms helped him hear the shape of the hair. Whether this was artistry or early-onset madness is unclear, but the results were legendary. Nobles competed to book La Fontaine during fêtes, hoping that a little bit of melodic fluffing would elevate their appearance and their chances of catching the king's eye. The Wigmakers, of course, became minor celebrities in their own right. Like modern-day stylists to the stars, they knew secrets. They whispered through powder. If a nobleman had lice, the wigmaker knew. If a duchess fainted because her wig weighed as much as a sack of flour, the wigmaker was sworn to silence. These artisans held reputations in their hands, literally. Some even left the court and opened private salons, where they charged outlandish fees to style the hair of those desperate to mimic Versailles fashion. The royal style, once born in a marble room under the gaze of a sun-emblazoned ceiling, began to trickle down. Carefully, expensively, and yet, the system was far from perfect. Wigs required maintenance. Lots of it. Powdering was messy. Imagine standing stock still as a man with a sieve blasted your head with a fine cloud of starch, chalk, and perfume. You'd hold a special cone over your face to avoid inhaling it. Or at least, that was the hope. More than a few courtiers coughed themselves silly before breakfast. There was also the matter of pest control. You're not ready for this, but it must be said, wigs could be infested. Yes, wig lice were a thing. They even had their own tiny combs, designed to sneak between the false curls and extricate the unwanted residents. You scratch your scalp reflexively, even though it's decades too late. Still, courtiers endured it. Because a royal wig wasn't just hair, it was a symbol, a billboard, a weapon. And for Louis XIV, it was both shield and stage. Behind the cascade of hair, he could maintain the illusion of eternal youth, health, and divinity. He could distract, deceive, and dominate. And the wigmakers? They weren't just artisans. They were illusionists. Their work masked fatigue, aged scalps, and stress. A king in a wig could be anything: a god, a warrior, a patron of the arts. Without it, he was just a man with thinning hair and too many enemies. The silence of the room presses in again. You pause before an open journal, its pages yellowed with time. It contains wig orders from 1685, handwritten in looping script. One entry reads, "For His Majesty, morning disposition wig. Requires curl of dignified temperament. Minimal rebellion at temples." You smile. Even centuries ago, people had bad hair days. You step away from the journal, shoes creaking softly on the floorboards, and you're pulled deeper into the world where identity is sculpted strand by strand. Your mind drifts to the fact that Louis's wigs weren't merely indulgences. They were political camouflage. The more elaborate the wig, the more it distracted from the reality behind it. By the 1670s, Louis XIV was in his prime, but even golden suns eventually start to set. He'd survived smallpox as a child, developed dental problems that would have most modern orthodontists weeping, and suffered the usual host of royal afflictions: stress, insomnia, and a workload measured in decrees and divine right. His real hair had long started to betray him. The wig, though? The wig never aged. That lush mane, layered and curled and powdered to lunar paleness, became the emblem of his permanence. And so, the wigs had to adapt, constantly. Each morning, a selection was brought before the king. Not unlike a menu. There were wigs for different moods, diplomatic meetings, parades, church visits, hunting expeditions, and even chess tournaments. Yes, apparently his gambit style featured a higher bouffant and tighter sides, possibly to prevent cheating glances. Every detail mattered: the tightness of the curls, the length of the tail, the volume of the temple poofs. Some mornings, the king simply pointed. Other days, he'd sigh and demand something less pious or more victorious. The mainstream historical detail here is how personal grooming and image became literal statecraft. Louis's public appearances were choreographed to the second. His levee and couchee, waking and sleeping rituals, involved dozens of people, each assigned specific gestures and garments. The choice of wig played into that pageantry. If the king wore a heavy confidence style with 4 layers of curls, everyone in court took notice. It meant something. It always did. But let's dip into fringe territory again, shall we? There are rumors, whispers in forgotten correspondence, that Louis occasionally wore decoy wigs, meaning, on certain days when he felt unwell or unenthusiastic, a favored courtier would don an exact replica of the king's style and be seen from a distance walking through the gardens or along the palace corridors. Was this a primitive form of body doubling, or just elite-level trolling? Historians still argue whether these mirror wigs actually existed or were the fevered dreams of jealous courtiers. But the idea lingers. Deliciously plausible. Point one such courtier, the Marquis de la Griffe, was supposedly chosen for his strong chin, unflinching gait, and wig-bearing shoulders. He'd perform brief walk-bys in dim light, while the real Louis sipped broth in bed. It was never confirmed, of course, but a grainy portrait exists, two identical silhouettes in identical wigs, one just slightly more fleshy. You have to squint. Another peculiar custom was the use of powder boys, young pages trained specifically to freshen the royal wig throughout the day. These boys carried pouches of scented starch, small combs, and tiny fans to maintain volume and freshness. The powder was often lavender or rose-infused, but sometimes had notes of ambergris. Yes, the whale stuff, which made the whole palace smell like an alchemist's daydream. Some powder boys reportedly tried to invent signature flourishes, puffing in little heart shapes or stars until a furious steward banned all improvisation, and the wigs themselves were not stored casually. Oh no, they rested on sculpted busts, named and catalogued, in rooms cooler than the rest of the palace to prevent warping. Le Grand Serpent needed to be curled weekly to maintain its dramatic cascade. La Victoire required extra starch before military briefings. There was even a traveling wig chest with shock-absorbing leather pouches and compartments for emergency powdering. Imagine a wig first aid kit, complete with pincers and heat stones. All of this supported one towering truth. Louis XIV didn't just wear a wig. He wore an institution. Still, not everyone found it inspiring. Satirists of the time, often writing anonymously to avoid getting mysteriously reassigned to the Bastille, began mocking the king's wig obsession. Cartoons depicted him as a sentient pom-pom with legs. One infamous pamphlet, The Man Beneath the Mane, posed the seditious question, what would remain if His Majesty shaved? Naturally, the authors were never found. What remains especially odd, though, is how the wigs influenced not just fashion but architecture. Stick with me. Versailles, in all its glimmering extravagance, was built to reinforce royal grandeur. But some scholars argue the tall ceilings, gold mirrors, and wide doors were designed, at least in part, to accommodate the ever-rising altitude of court wigs. Historians still argue whether this is accurate or just a case of powdered revisionism, but you must admit, the symmetry is compelling. Big hair, bigger rooms, you pass under a low wooden beam, ironically low, and duck automatically, as though your own invisible wig might snag. You chuckle softly. It's strange how easy it is to start seeing the world through Louis's powdered eyes. Everything, distance, stature, light, measured by how a curl holds its place. Before you know it, you're back in the corridor, footsteps echoing faintly in the hush. A tray with wig pins glints in the corner. You imagine a flurry of servants scurrying before sunrise, curling irons clinking, powdered fingers fluttering like moths over royal strands, and somewhere, one nervous assistant whispers, "Not too much powder today." He's meeting the Pope's envoy. The door creaks behind you as you wander into the next chamber, a quieter one, lined with faded tapestries and ornate drawers. This must have been where some of the lesser wigs were kept. Not the star pieces, mind you, but the everyday grandeur variety. Like wearing designer sweatpants to the bakery. Still opulent, but dialed down just enough to suggest, I care, but not too much. As you trail your fingers across a velvet-lined shelf, it becomes clear that the Sun King's obsession wasn't an isolated vanity. It ignited a bonfire of imitation across Europe. Courtiers, ministers, ambassadors, and even foreign monarchs scrambled to replicate his style. To not wear a wig, or worse, to wear a frumpy one, was social suicide at Versailles. It was the 17th century equivalent of arriving at a Met Gala in flip-flops and a sandwich. Point one of the more mainstream historical facts you absorb here is this: the Sun King's personal aesthetic shaped entire economies. The booming wig industry in France supported thousands, from sheep herders and hair merchants to glue makers and wig block sculptors. That's right. Each wig needed a form to rest on when not in use. These forms, called perruquiers' busts, were often made of wood or marble and occasionally carved to look like tiny versions of Louis himself. Nothing says commitment like storing your hair on your own tiny doppelganger. There were even guilds specifically for wig makers, with strict apprenticeships and regulations. Some wigs cost the equivalent of a modest house. Others were so valuable they were passed down in wills, like grand estates or mysteriously cursed amulets. But the fringe detail that really tickles your brain tonight. Some of Louis's wigs were said to contain hidden compartments. No, not for smuggling messages to enemy spies, though admit it, that would have been amazing, but for holding scented cloths, rosaries, and even small glass phials of smelling salts. Why? Because a full day of royal business could be dizzying, and heaven forbid the king swoon mid-edict. With a quick tilt of the head, a servant could reach into the wig and retrieve a refreshment. Think of it as the 17th century version of a fanny pack. But, hair. Scholars remain divided on whether this was common practice or just an exaggerated tale repeated by bored valet scribes. Still, imagine the intimacy of that moment. A page gently tugging on the back ringlet, and voila, lavender oil for the monarch's temples. Makes you rethink your own hair choices, doesn't it? As the fashion storm spiraled outward from Versailles, foreign leaders began to twist the trend into their own versions. Charles II of England, eager to keep up with his cousin's glossy locks, adopted the periwig with an almost competitive zeal. His court soon looked like a chorus line of disgruntled sheepdogs. And over in Prussia, wigs became stiffer, more geometric, more efficient. Each region interpreted the wig language like dialects, some curls looser, some powdered darker, others with exaggerated swoops like icing on a wedding cake. That, of course, not everyone had the budget or the patience for this wig explosion. So, some opted for what could charitably be called half wigs. These were essentially toupees with ambitions. They sat only on the crown and were secured with ribbons or pins, giving the illusion of a full head of luscious curls without the actual burden. A kind of wig mullet. Business on top, resignation on the sides. Back in France, the wig industry began creating catalogs, actual printed guides showing available styles, accessories, and even seasonal collections. Historians still argue whether this constituted the birth of modern fashion marketing. After all, there's something terribly familiar about a lady flipping through a pamphlet and whispering, "Oh, the Dauphine has this one. I simply must get it in ash blonde." You pause at one of those catalogs, its pages yellowed and delicately bound. The illustrations are precise, almost reverent. Each curl is labeled, each style given a poetic name. La Tempête, Leclerc, Le Philosophe. Some sound like perfumes. Others sound like Pokemon evolutions. But all of them whisper status, drama, and a hint of satire. A small note in the margin, pinned in a sleepy scrawl, reads, "Too many curls. Could not see dog." This was also the golden age of hair accessories. Pins, feathers, ribbons, fake birds, and yes, even porcelain ships perched atop heads like miniature dioramas. There's a well-documented case of Madame de Montpensier arriving at court with a tiny rotating carousel in her hair, powered by clockwork. She was almost banned from the chapel for summoning frivolity. You imagine Louis secretly approving, or maybe just mildly jealous he hadn't thought of it first. Yet despite the outlandishness, there was a deep psychology behind all this. The wigs were armor, against aging, against sickness, against the perception of weakness. Louis, who viewed his body as a vessel of divine right, could not afford to appear frail. The thicker the wig, the stronger the message, "I endure." Even as his teeth fell out, even as gout nibbled his joints, his wigs defied entropy. You settle on a cushioned bench, gaze drifting to a tall mirror framed in gold. For a second, you imagine yourself in a full court ensemble, curls brushing your shoulders, feathers nodding with each blink. It's absurd. It's wonderful. It's almost cozy. You chuckle softly, your eyelids beginning to droop under the weight of so much powdered regality. Maybe tomorrow you'll wear a hat, just a small one. The light dims ever so slightly as you step across a checkered marble floor into what seems like the administrative wing of this royal hair affair. You half expect a court official to appear with a clipboard and an exasperated sigh, muttering something about curl rotation schedules and inventory discrepancies in the Temple Bouffant division. But instead, the silence here is heavy with the paperwork of legacy that you're now in the heart of the bureaucracy that kept all 40 wigmakers employed, not merely in their styling artistry, but in a rotational system so intricately scheduled, it might as well have been invented by NASA. Yes, the Palace of Versailles had a literal calendar for hair maintenance. Each royal wig was assigned a meticulous care cycle, cleansing with wine or rose water, brushing with boar bristle combs, repowdering with starch or pulverized lavender, and being rested on a polished bust under the correct phase of the moon. Okay, that last part might be exaggeration, but it wouldn't surprise you that here's your mainstream historical anchor. Louis XIV formalized the Maison du Roi, the royal household structure, which included everything from chefs to falconers to, of course, the wigmakers. They were technically part of the king's wardrobe staff, known as the garde-robe. Within that group, wigmakers, les perruquiers, held a position akin to mid-tier nobility. They were paid extremely well, provided housing near the palace, and some even received pensions. Their duties? Not only to craft and maintain the wigs, but also to offer styling advice, manage supplies, and, this is key, ensure discretion. After all, a misplaced wig could be a diplomatic catastrophe. You can't host the ambassador from Spain while looking like a sad, deflated pastry. Now for your quirky tidbit. Wig powder came in a rainbow of scents and shades. Yes, white was the classic look, but aristocrats sometimes chose blue, pink, lilac, even pistachio. The powder didn't just cover grease or give volume. It signaled mood. Feeling melancholy? Lavender. Feeling flirtatious? Rose. Hosting an opera? Go full citrus. And when powdered, the wig was gently tapped with silk pads, called pomanders, which left delicate floral prints that only up-close observers would see. Essentially, you were creating a scratch-and-sniff impressionist painting on your own scalp. Some wigs were powdered so aggressively that guests sitting too close could leave gatherings looking like powdered donuts. And so, fans became not just fashion accessories, but protective shields. A well-trained courtier could flutter one open just in time to deflect a cloud of almond-scented starch from her décolletage. But not everyone found the whole enterprise charming. Historians still argue whether Louis himself ever grumbled about the sheer scale of the wig economy he had spawned. Did he sit one evening, fingers rubbing his aching scalp beneath 3 pounds of sculpted ambition, and wonder, have I gone too far? Maybe, maybe not. What we do know is that he never publicly discouraged it. In fact, whenever he felt his image needed boosting, after a war, during a political scandal, he would commission a new portrait featuring a fresh wig. Bigger, grander, more emotionally stable than his enemies' wigs. You spot one such portrait now, hanging crookedly near a forgotten coat hook. Louis XIV, draped in ermine, hair cascading like a shampoo commercial in slow motion. His gaze isn't just confident, it's serene, as if to say, yes, I do know my curls are perfect. Thank you for noticing. The artist, Hyacinthe Rigaud, was practically the official hype man for royal follicles. He painted Louis more times than anyone else, always emphasizing the hair, the stance, the divine glow. Some say Rigaud added extra curl layers with a flick of brush and bravado. Historians still debate whether this was artistic license or mild sabotage from an overworked painter desperate to get home before midnight. Yet there's a dusty document near the frame, a payroll list. Names of wigmakers line the page, some with notes beside them. Prefers goose fat primer, specializes in wind-resistant styles, and once fainted at sight of Queen's pigeon hat. Their talents were specialized. One might only do side curls. Another might be the powdering expert. A third, tasked with transporting wigs via velvet boxes across the palace, nicknamed the Hair Whisperer. Their craftsmanship was akin to modern haute couture. Personal, obsessive, sometimes mad. And as you walk farther down the hall, you come to understand how deeply the wig world affected everything else. Fashion, obviously, but also posture. Wigs could weigh 3 to 5 pounds, so courtiers walked with stiff, gliding grace, partly out of elegance, partly to avoid dislocating something. Some developed back pain, prompting inventors to create neck cradles hidden beneath collars. The wig, you see, did not stop when it left the head. It continued down the spine. Why now? You're wondering. Surely the common folk didn't participate in this madness? Correct. For the peasantry, wigs were mostly out of reach, except as hand-me-downs or cheap flour-dusted imitations. Occasionally, barbers in provincial towns would rent wigs for special occasions. Yes, rent. Like tuxedos. One evening of aristocratic illusion for just a few sous. And people took it. Because if you walked into a ballroom with a rented blonde cascade, you weren't just a miller's son. You were a duke's distant cousin with a tragic past and a mysterious fortune. For 3 hours, at least. But even among the elite, the tide would eventually turn. You spot an early pamphlet pinned on a corkboard, anonymously authored, arguing against wigs as burdens of excess and monuments to vanity. It isn't signed, though many believe it was penned by a board clerk during a tax audit. It's the beginning of what we might call the first stirrings of wig fatigue. Still, for now, you're firmly entrenched in the age of powdered perfection. The air smells faintly of crushed violets and old starch. Your neck feels heavier just imagining it. But the floor beneath your feet is warm, the velvet nearby is soft, and for a brief moment, you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you could pull off a pistachio-powdered half-wig. You take a step further into the labyrinth of Versailles, the scent of lavender powder still lingering faintly, as if the walls themselves have absorbed the fragrance over centuries. The tapestries on the walls ripple ever so slightly in a draft you can't place, and as your fingers graze a velvet-covered banister, you can almost hear the rustling of satin breeches and whispered gossip carried down this very corridor. Ahead, a set of carved double doors beckons, flaunting curling cherubs above their frames like overenthusiastic cheerleaders for the monarchy's haircare regime. Through the doors, you emerge into the backstage of court life, what was known to the insiders as the cabinet de toilette. This is where the real magic happened, far from the grand mirrors and gilded salons. It's less glamorous, more practical, filled with lacquered trays, head molds, tools resembling dental equipment, and jars of powders labeled in a spidery French script. You wouldn't be shocked to find a half-finished wig reclining on a mannequin head, looking half like a lion's mane, half like a soufflé in distress. Mainstream fact? These rooms were staffed by an elite handful of the king's personal valets and specialists who orchestrated what was known as the lever, the royal rising ritual. Louis XIV's morning toilette was a ceremonial event in itself. A select group of nobles, doctors, courtiers, and of course, the wigmakers, were allowed to attend as the king was gradually dressed and assembled like a high-stakes game of human Jenga. His wig, yes, the final flourish, was placed with solemn reverence, always chosen from among several options, depending on the occasion, the weather, and perhaps his mood. Here's your quirky tidbit. Royal wig fittings were sometimes accompanied by music. Imagine that. You're getting your powdered curls adjusted while a trio of court musicians plays a minuet nearby to soothe the tension of a misaligned forelock. One royal wigmaker even reportedly hired a lute player to sit in his workspace, believing that music would coax the hair into harmony. Historians are still debating whether this was sincere artistic belief or just a cunning excuse to deduct the lute player as a business expense. Now, as you tiptoe around this intimate chamber, you notice how everything was designed for both efficiency and extravagance. There were foldable wig stands, traveling wig chests with compartments for powder, brush, and emergency ribbon, and even collapsible seats for the king to rest while his curls were fluffed. The walls were lined with painted panels that could be swung open to reveal hidden cubbies, some filled with wigs in progress, others with scented oils or powdered gloves. But here's where things get messy. Because while Louis adored ceremony, he also hated delays. A wig that took too long to adjust could result in a cold stare, or worse, being dismissed from the inner circle. The pressure on wigmakers was enormous. One of them, a fellow named Jacques the Elder, reportedly had a nervous tic so severe that he developed a stutter, except when discussing hair, at which point he could deliver entire treatises on follicular symmetry without pause. He once presented the king with a wig styled like a gentle waterfall. Louis wore it for exactly 1 hour, then declared it too introspective, and never touched it again. Now, here's something historians still argue about. Did the king ever use fake hair to cover more than baldness? There are tantalizing rumors that Louis had several mood wigs, including one that supposedly curled downward to signal melancholy, and another arranged like a rising sunburst to signify triumph. Some believe this was coded communication to the court. If he showed up wearing his rage ringlets, you knew to back off on discussing taxes. Others insist this is apocryphal, that no such wig taxonomy existed, and that any pattern in the king's styles was entirely coincidental. Still, wouldn't it be lovely if your hair could say, "Not today, Jacques"? You sit for a moment on a padded stool, the type used by wigmakers when powdering wigs for hours at a time. The cushioning is surprisingly firm, likely horsehair, and as you imagine the daily routine, the logistical complexity becomes clearer. Every strand mattered. Curves had to be precise. Powder distribution required skill. And if the powder clumped? Disaster. To fix this, some wigmakers developed elaborate sieves and fans, creating a miniature indoor snowstorm just to set the right tone. Picture it, a cloud of lilac dust swirling through filtered sunlight, settling gently over a 40-year-old nobleman whose sole duty that afternoon is to compliment the queen's poodles. What's more, wigs had to be maintained off the head as well. Between wearings, they were brushed, sprayed with lavender water, rested, and sometimes stitched back into shape if curls had gone rogue. One wigmaker reportedly employed his teenage son solely to fluff and rotate the wigs at regular intervals to prevent stylistic collapse. Talk about a summer job, and then there's the matter of innovation. You stumble across a sketch pinned to a board, some kind of early patent drawing. It looks like a collapsible powdered wig dryer powered by foot bellows. Think of it as the 17th century version of a Dyson hair tool. The design is intricate, involving copper tubes, swan motifs, and a detachable powder trap. It's unclear if it was ever built, but the ambition alone deserves applause. Or a nap. Some royal wigmakers became celebrities in their own right. They published style books, charged outrageous commissions, and were sought after by foreign courts. One even tried to open a wig boutique in Vienna, only to be shut down by Austrian nobles who claimed their heads were naturally sufficient. The same wigmaker was later spotted selling powdered beards in Venice. Ambition never dies. It simply changes facial zones. You rise and move toward a tall mirror, fogged at the edges with age. You imagine your own reflection donning a towering cascade of caramel curls, pinned with pearl combs and a modest ostrich plume. Because subtlety is key, after all. The wig, surprisingly, doesn't feel too far removed from modern performance art or runway fashion. It's about declaring identity, about turning heads before you've spoken a word, about making the world say, "What on earth is happening up there? And why do I love it?" And just before you step away, you spot one last object, a delicate silver comb, engraved with the initials LS. Was it Louis's? A gift from a wigmaker? A lost prop from a royal tantrum? You'll never know for sure, but as the scent of violet powder settles around you again, and the hush of the chamber folds over your shoulders like a velvet robe, you start to believe that behind every great king is a team of 40 very busy, very stressed wigmakers. The hallways feel quieter now, the echo of powdered footsteps muffled by the plush of ancient rugs. You trail your fingers along carved wainscoting, each groove dusty with centuries of decisions, declarations, and possibly dandruff. The farther you wander from the opulence of the main chambers, the closer you come to the inner arteries of the royal haircare empire, the workspaces and quarters of the wigmakers themselves. These were no mere tailors of tresses. They were engineers of illusion, tirelessly toiling in the wings to maintain a kingdom's follicular facade. Mainstream historical fact: by the late 17th century, the royal household employed a dedicated team of wig artisans, not just hairdressers, but sculptors de perruques. These artisans weren't just selected for skill. They had to pass background checks, prove moral character, and in some cases, swear oaths of discretion. You don't spend your life working 6 inches from the king's ears without hearing the occasional scandalous mutter. Discretion was, as they say, part of the styling gel. You push through a narrow door and find yourself in a candlelit chamber filled with what look like miniature gallows, wooden frames holding half-finished wigs like eerie trophy heads. Twine dangles from the ceiling, strung with clusters of combs, ribbons, pins, and tiny scented sachets. The scent of beeswax and stale talc hangs in the air, and it's suddenly easy to imagine the hiss of heated curling rods and the muttered curses of a stylist racing against the sunrise. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some wigmakers kept trained cats in their quarters, not as pets, but as anti-vermin security. Mice were notorious for nesting in powdered wigs, drawn to the starches, oils, and warmth. Imagine pulling a royal updo off its stand, only to find a mouse family cozily ensconced in its curls. Cat patrols were considered a vital line of defense. One memoir even recounts a feline named Marquise de Miaou who received an honorary silk ribbon after thwarting a mouse-related wig disaster the night before a diplomatic banquet. But behind the jokes and the powder lies an astonishing truth. These wigmakers were innovators. Necessity breeds invention, and the scale of Louis XIV's demand meant they had to industrialize glamour. They created wig molds carved from wood or plaster to maintain consistent head sizes. They standardized curls with numbered patterns. C3 might mean a soft left twist while R5 indicated a tight, right spiraling ringlet. It was, essentially, Baroque-era coding. If you're thinking this sounds like a secret menu at a particularly snobby coffee shop, you're not wrong. Historians still argue whether the idea for this wig curl code system came from Louis himself. Some believe he requested it after seeing inconsistencies in portraits. One day his hair curled flirtatiously, the next it drooped like wet linguine. Others say it emerged from the wigmaker's own frustration, a way to maintain uniformity across a team who worked on different wigs in parallel. Either way, the result was a surprisingly bureaucratic approach to beauty. You pause beside a long workbench, stained with pomade and singe marks. Here, the wigmakers would have assembled their creations, sewing in human hair, often purchased from peasants or prisoners, mixed with horsehair for body and goat hair for sheen. The goal wasn't realism. It was grandeur. These wigs weren't trying to look like real hair. They were trying to look like power made tangible, like authority you could balance a tray of canapes on. A clipboard. Well, a slat of wood with notes scrawled in iron gall ink catches your eye. It appears to be a schedule. Monday, 6 a.m., Le Grand Boucle for Lou Roy. 6:20 a.m., Madame de Maintenon, coiffure à l'espérance. 7 a.m., powder application and curl hold spray trial. Yes, even trials. They experimented relentlessly. New powders, new fixatives, even new hair sourcing techniques. There's an apocryphal tale of a wigmaker who once ordered an entire bale of hair from Turkish Angora goats, claiming it captured moonlight better. The wig reportedly shimmered like frost under candlelight, but smelled faintly of sheep pen. You duck through another archway into a slightly larger room, the storage chamber. Shelf after shelf holds wig boxes labeled by owner, occasion, and curl type. Some are rimmed in velvet. Others are wax-sealed. The king's personal box has gold trim and a tiny lion clasp, roaring eternally at the indignity of being a hair container. You gently open one and are greeted by a wig shaped like a gentle spiral staircase. A showpiece, perhaps, or a statement on social hierarchy. In the corner, you spot a dusty harp, its strings slack but intact. No one's played it in ages, but you imagine a wig maker pausing his work for a moment's strum while waiting for the glue to set. Artistic souls, after all, require gentle distraction. Just be glad they didn't have access to social media, or Versailles might have seen the birth of the first #WigTalk. Now, something darker lurks beneath this room's charming dust: the toll. Wigmakers didn't live easy lives. The powders they used, especially white lead, were toxic. Many developed respiratory issues, skin lesions, even neurological symptoms. They coughed, they itched, they trembled. One infamous royal stylist, Pierre Blanc, went blind in one eye after 20 years of daily exposure. He claimed he could still style by touch, but let's just say his later creations were described as emotionally abstract. And yet, they kept going. Because the king's image depended on it. Because court fashion demanded it. Because being a royal wig maker, despite the risks, was still better than being a baker in a town where flour was worth more than gold powder. Status could protect you from starvation, but not necessarily from the side effects of elegance. You lean back against a timber beam and close your eyes for a second. The soft murmur of fabric on fabric, the whisper of powdered fingers fluffing a curl, just so. These sounds persist in your imagination like ghostly echoes. In these chambers, beauty was manufactured daily, not as vanity, but as strategy. Every curl a signal, every style a message, and every wig a carefully constructed lie we all agreed to believe. Just before you leave, your eye catches something half buried in a drawer, a tiny mirror framed in brass, its surface fogged with time. You lift it, and for a moment, it reflects your tired eyes surrounded by an imagined crown of powdered hair. Not a king, not a servant, just someone passing through, peeking behind the powdered curtain, and now, on you go, deeper still, toward the places where illusion and power braided together tighter than any ribbon in the king's collection. You descend another creaky stairwell, spiraling gently downward as the stone walls draw closer, the air denser with every step. The scent of wax gives way to something more organic, damp earth, preserved leather, a hint of lavender sachet battling valiantly against centuries of mildew. You've entered the archival underbelly of Versailles, where Wigmakers' records were stashed like royal secrets. And in these brittle pages lies a story less told, the economic labyrinth of hair sourcing. Mainstream historical fact: Louis XIV's court required an astonishing amount of human hair, enough to supply over 40 wigmakers, their apprentices, and a host of secondary stylists. The majority of this hair didn't come from nobility. It came from peasants, prisoners, and the desperately poor. Traveling hair merchants, known charmingly as coupeurs de cheveux, roamed the countryside offering coin for locks. Children were often prime targets, as their hair was considered softer, shinier, and more pliant. It sounds predatory because, well, it was. You brush your hand across a faded ledger, its ink turned rust brown with time. Columns list weight, color, source, and price. 6 ounces, flaxen, age 12, village of Clary. There's something chilling about the specificity. Somewhere in France, a child's shorn curls traveled to Versailles and were stitched into the curls of a duke's hunting wig. It's one of those moments where beauty and cruelty tap politely at the same dance card. Quirky tidbit? Occasionally, nobles donated their own hair for wigs, especially when fashion shifted toward natural looks. Marie-Angelique de Fontenoy once gifted her locks to her husband's coronation wig, declaring it an act of intimate patriotism. Historians aren't sure if he appreciated the gesture, especially since the wig turned greenish after a few weeks. Might have been the damp storage. Might have been marital karma. And speaking of oddities, did you know some wigmakers turned to cadavers for hair? Yep, morgue-harvested strands, often from the unclaimed deceased. While it wasn't common practice, ethical concerns aside, it did happen, particularly in times of war or plague when hair merchants faced shortages. The euphemism used was hair of uncertain origin, which honestly sounds like something you'd see on a suspicious shampoo bottle. Historians still argue whether the crown explicitly endorsed these darker sourcing methods. Some say the royal accountants looked the other way, eager to keep prices down and supply flowing. Others insist the king issued discreet orders to avoid funereal strands. Either way, documentation on the matter is inconsistent, lost to fire, time, or perhaps deliberately misfiled under something like miscellaneous powders. You make your way down a hallway lit by narrow windows, the light filtered through warped glass. On the walls hang portraits of Wigmakers Guild leaders, smiling solemnly in ruffled cravats, holding scissors like scepters. It's easy to forget they were craftsmen, many with generations of expertise passed down. Some families had been wig artisans since before the 100 Years' War. Their coats of arms often featured shears, combs, and occasionally, oddly aggressive squirrels. At the heart of the hallway lies a record room with scrolls and binding cords, stacked in long, leaning towers. Here, you uncover the economics behind the glamour, spreadsheets, or their paper ancestors, detailing not just sourcing, but pricing strategies. Certain colors were more expensive. Platinum blonde was considered rare and thus sold at a premium. Auburns were mid-range. Jet black, depending on regional origin, might carry a surcharge due to excess gloss. Imagine telling a duke his curls cost more because they were too shiny. Sounds petty, until you remember these are the same people who coordinated shoe buckles with moon phases There's a fragile pamphlet tucked between thicker tomes. It's titled Traits sur les chevaux et les perruques and offers guidelines for hair collection and conditioning. Some recommendations include rinsing with rose water, drying in shade to prevent yellowing, and braiding for shipment. There's also an entire section devoted to soothing techniques when dealing with reluctant donors, which is a nice way of saying bribe them with bread. And then you find the scandalous registry, locked in a wooden chest with a brass latch. Someone, somewhere thought this should be kept hush-hush. Inside are purchase orders marked with red wax seals. One, dated during the harsh winter of 1684, lists an urgent order for 20 wigs for the foreign delegation from Sweden. Due to the snowstorm, no hair merchants could deliver in time. So, the king's valet authorized procurement from local hospitals. The entry reads, acquired via Paris hospice, expedited via coach, powdered upon arrival. The delegation never knew, but it sparked quiet outrage among purists in the guild, some of whom swore off emergency wigs forever. You step away from the chest and take a long breath. It's a lot to absorb. How every elaborate twist, every powdered ringlet, every cascading fall of curls was underpinned by a murky economy of desperation, vanity, and strategic sourcing. The final flourish you saw atop a nobleman's head was just the tip of a tangled iceberg made of contracts, coin, and cut strands. And still, the machine churned. Because Versailles couldn't afford to look less than spectacular. If a courtier's wig looked limp or too obviously stitched, it wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a breach in the armor of illusion. A thread pulled too hard that might unravel a kingdom's mystique. As you ascend back into the light, you catch sight of a faded drawing pinned near the staircase. An anonymous sketch of a street merchant holding scissors in one hand and a scale in the other. The caption reads, locks for bread, curls for coin. It's meant to be satire, but you suspect it's closer to truth than most like to admit. You reach the next corridor, where the focus shifts from the wig's origin to how they were transported, maintained, and sometimes, disastrously, misused. But that's a tale for the next room, the next whisper of powdered footsteps behind gilded doors. You follow the scent of powder and starch to a narrow hallway, filled with creaking floorboards and murmurs from behind lacquered doors. This is the domestic wing, not of kings or queens, but of their servants. And tucked between the linen closets and embroidery rooms lies a suite once reserved for a special breed of household wizard, the wig stewards. Their job? Transporting, maintaining, and sometimes rescuing royal wigs from absolute disaster. Mainstream historical fact. Louis XIV's court didn't just wear wigs, they maintained them with military-grade precision. Each major noble had wig trunks labeled by day and occasion. There were wigs for mornings, afternoons, council meetings, duels, operas, and even mourning. Yes, your sad wig collection was a real thing. These were kept in leather-lined cases, often perfumed with sachets of lavender or orris root, and transported by assigned valets or pages on foot, horseback, or ornate carriages built just for hat boxes and hair. You crack open a lacquered trunk in the corner, and inside, 3 neatly coiled, grayish wigs, each tied with ribbons and tagged with calligraphed notes, for Thursday garden rounds, ambassadorial supper, burgundy, spare, lice-compliant. Lice, of course, being the not-so-hidden villain of wig life. Powder masked a lot, but it couldn't conquer everything. Quirky tidbit? A few overly ambitious nobles experimented with wig-scented messages. Imagine having a footman deliver a curly bundle smelling of bergamot to flirt with a duchess across the gardens. Supposedly, one courtier proposed via wig, embedding a lock of the woman's own hair inside a ringlet. It backfired when the duchess fainted, thinking her hair had been stolen by witches. And frankly, given how often strands went missing, she might have been right. The hallway gives way to a preparation chamber, long tables under skylights, where assistants brushed, steamed, and repaired the wigs of the day. You run your fingers over a mahogany wig rack shaped like a goose. One wig rests in its curved neck, mid-fluff. The scent of hot starch and violet water clings to the air. There's an array of brushes with boar bristle teeth and handles carved into angels, nymphs, and, curiously, a man wrestling a badger. Historians still argue whether wigs were powdered daily or kept primed in storage. Some believe the king's top wigs were powdered several times a week, even if unworn, to keep their sheen consistent. Others point to expense records that suggest powdering was done on demand, just before presentation. What's certain is that overpowdering could destroy a wig's shape and cause the hair to clump like wet biscuits, according to one steward's diary. Speaking of disasters, remember the Swedish delegation back in section 17? Well, that wasn't the only wig crisis. One infamous incident in 1701 involved the Dauphin's hunt wig, which had been improperly pinned and flew off during a fox chase, landing in a puddle. The fox, apparently unamused, sat on it. The entire affair caused such embarrassment that wig pins were redesigned with tighter clasps and nicknamed fox locks. The steward responsible was reassigned to chamber pot duty. Another tale, likely exaggerated but too delightful to ignore, involves a rogue valet who smuggled messages between courtiers by hiding slips of parchment inside the hollow curls of unused wigs. When uncovered, he claimed it was an act of historical preservation. The king wasn't amused, but the wigmakers found it brilliant. They even designed a secret pocket coil for discreet communication. Essentially, Versailles invented the first Bluetooth headset, except made of human hair and betrayal. You move to the far end of the chamber where a large book rests, Le Registre de Accidents Capillaires, the hair calamities register. Each page recounts disasters both tragic and hilarious. Wigs dropped in fountains, wigs peed on by dogs, wigs consumed by firecrackers during New Year's. One entry simply reads, Chevalier de Guise attempted tightrope walk in ceremonial wig. Wig did not survive. Neither did trousers. There were also logistical nightmares. Transporting wigs across long distances meant dealing with rain, mud, and horse jolts. Special carriages were commissioned with temperature insulation, essentially 17th-century climate-controlled delivery systems. One model, designed for the Comte d'Artois, featured velvet-lined wig hooks and a built-in potpourri drawer. Another had footmen whose sole job was to cushion the wigs during rough terrain, using padded gloves like fashion paramedics. At one point, Versailles maintained an official wig dispatch ledger. Pages logged destination, time of departure, and bounce status. Bounce status ranged from serene to vigorous, which sounds like a yoga class but referred to how much jostling the wigs endured. If a delivery bounced too much, it was flagged for repowdering or full restyling. And then, there were the lost-in-transit cases. A wig intended for the Duke of Maine's baptismal ceremony was accidentally delivered to a brewer in Dijon, who wore it for 3 days thinking it was a new priestly trend. When the courier finally reclaimed it, the wig had absorbed enough ale fumes to be declared unsalvageable. The brewer, however, was never the same. He reportedly wore a powdered scarf for the rest of his life. You walk past a display of wig maintenance tools, tiny combs, silk polishing cloths, and hair-curdling irons. Not for fear, but for curl formation. Next to them lies a stained smock that once belonged to Master Armand, the court's wig surgeon. He specialized in repairing balding wigs, reweaving loose hair, and performing what he called aesthetic CPR. His motto? It's never dead, just asleep. And still, through all the tangled logistics and absurd mishaps, the court's dedication to wigs endured. Why? Because the illusion had to hold. No wrinkle, stain, or misaligned curl could pierce the performance of divine monarchy. Behind the curtain of pomp was a choreography of human error, ingenuity, and a whole lot of pomade. Now, you exit the steward's chambers and step into an even stranger room, the one where wigs weren't just maintained, but transformed into theater. They didn't call it the Masquerade Mill for nothing. You step into the Masquerade Mill, a vaulted chamber of theatrical absurdity where wigs weren't just coiffed, they were weaponized. In here, hair became fantasy, wigs grew horns, swirls, ships, and entire tableaus. This wasn't a salon. This was a laboratory for the fabulously unhinged. And you, dear time traveler in silk slippers, are now witness to some of the wildest scalping stunts of Louis XIV's twilight years. Mainstream historical fact. Court masquerades weren't merely parties. They were staged spectacles of dominance, myth, and coded flirtation. And wigs? They were the headline act. For these evenings, wig makers pushed their artistry to extremes, sculpting gravity-defying constructions that could include wire frames, artificial birds, or even working candle fixtures. Yes, actual flames on your scalp. Nobody tell the fire marshal. Tonight, a footman is preparing the Archduchess's Sea Triumph wig, a 3-foot-tall confection resembling Poseidon's chariot, complete with gilt seashells and a sail made of lace. It's mounted on a corset-hinged steel skeleton that buckles under the chin. The hair is powdered an eerie seafoam blue, matching her embroidered train. The final touch? A wax dolphin nestled behind her left ear, spouting rose water mist from its mouth. You watch a steward refill the tiny spritzer. Yes, that's someone's job. Quirky tidbit. In 1699, one wig included a tiny mechanical automaton that bowed whenever its wearer curtsied. Unfortunately, it shorted out halfway through a minuet and flung itself at the Swedish ambassador. Whether this was an accident or intentional sabotage is still debated. But what's clear is that after that, all motion-enabled wigs had to be pre-approved by a royal engineer. You pass another wig on a rotating stand. This one is styled to resemble a mountain village, complete with fake snow, sifted sugar, a paper mill, and little goat figurines affixed with pins. Its owner, the Comtesse de Laborde, wore it for a pastoral dreams masquerade, reportedly causing several courtiers to faint from sheer cognitive dissonance. Historians still argue whether wigs like these were one-offs for parody or part of an intentional trend towards surrealism in court fashion. One diary entry calls them noble absurdities. Another suggests that the king himself encouraged it to distract from his aging features. You reach the wing of wig theatrics, where mannequins display the most famous triumphs and failures of Versailles hair game. There's the volcano wig of 1704, a towering black beehive with crimson silk smoke and actual sparklers threaded into the core. It was only lit once, on New Year's Eve, and promptly banned when it singed the Duchess of Bourbon's parrot. Then, the agricultural crown, commissioned by the Ministry of Grain, featuring faux wheat stalks, a marzipan lamb, and a working windmill. It was meant to symbolize France's agricultural bounty, but collapsed in humidity. The resulting incident, now known as the flower shower, is immortalized in no fewer than 3 comedic paintings. Beneath each masterpiece is a brass plaque describing the occasion, materials used, and disaster risk rating: low, moderate, or run. There's a chalkboard tracking burn injuries, collapse incidents, and allergic reactions caused by goose feathers, tinsel, or shellac. One column simply reads, "Was it worth it?" and every tally mark is a resounding yes. Behind a curtain is the Mockery Hall, a room of rejected prototypes, wigs shaped like frogs, a spinning sundial design that couldn't hold still, a wig with music box parts that accidentally played 2 tunes at once, Bach and peasant lullabies, absolutely scandalous. You peer at a headpiece lined with tiny metal bells designed to chime with each step. Sadly, the bells attracted a swarm of bees during rehearsal. The wearer was fine. The bees, less so. Historians still debate how many of these outlandish wigs were sincerely worn versus paraded in jest. One faction believes the most extreme examples were only displayed in the privacy of intimate salons or reveal parties, while another argues they reflected a genuine push for hair-driven one-upmanship in an era obsessed with spectacle. But why? You wonder, did they go so far? Was it all vanity? Possibly. But more than that, it was power signaling. Hair that defied gravity symbolized control over the uncontrollable. A wig that mimicked Neptune's beard or a hunting scene with real antlers wasn't just fashion. It was a billboard. I have time, servants, money, and the gall to turn my forehead into a fresco. Some courtiers kept wig diaries, noting which styles they wore, who complimented them, and which ones caused too much itching. One such diary, penned by Viscount Orleans, includes a sketch of a gondola wig that could actually float. He tested it by placing it on his valet's head and tossing him in the lily pond. The valet swam to shore. The wig did not. You end up near a dusty cabinet marked "Wigs of Protest." These weren't the fabulous ones. They were quiet rebellions. A shortcut style worn by a liberal cousin. A deliberately underpowdered piece from the early 1700s. One wig bears a single peacock feather, a statement, allegedly, against the Queen's excesses. Tiny gestures, maybe, but in a world where hair equaled identity, they meant everything. You run your fingers along a velvet ribbon tied around a final display wig. Its label reads, simply, "The Last Masquerade." This one's made of chestnut horsehair and fine wool, dyed indigo and arranged like storm clouds. The courtier who wore it passed out from heat before entering the ballroom. But even in collapse, she looked magnificent. The air in the masquerade mill carries hints of powder, burnt lace, and old lavender. You feel the weight of it all. How many hours of craftsmanship for a single night? How much laughter and pain curled into these silent monuments to pride, performance, and preposterous flair. And just when you think wigs can't get weirder, a steward beckons you down a tight spiral stair. Apparently, there's one final room where wigs met science, war, and espionage. You duck your head and descend the spiral stair, stone steps lit by flickering sconces that cast elongated shadows along the walls. The scent changes subtly. Powder gives way to iron, musk, and something faintly electrical. Down here, in the lowest vaults of the perruquier's domain, you find the wig intelligence cell. Yes, that's right. Spy wigs. Mainstream historical fact. By the late 17th century, France had developed one of Europe's most intricate court surveillance systems. Letters were intercepted, salons were infiltrated, and even hair became a vector of statecraft. It turns out that when you have 40 wigmakers on retainer, a few of them end up in less than glamorous roles, like hiding rolled documents, poison vials, or listening tubes inside bundles of hair. The vault you enter is cold, silent, and covered in glass cases, each containing wigs used for special purpose. A white-streaked wig once worn by the Duc d'Aumale includes a hollowed-out top knot just wide enough to smuggle a royal seal across the border. Another, jet black and coiled in tight curls, is reinforced with steel wire and weighted pins, a literal weapon. The margin notes claim it could knock out a man at close range. Concealed cudgel. The tag reads in copperplate script, "Quirky tidbit." One of the more infamous wigs here belonged to a court jester who doubled as an informant. Hidden beneath the jester's fluffed green pompadour was a primitive voice amplifier, a curved brass horn designed to discreetly pick up gossip from across a ballroom. It made the wearer slightly lopsided and gave him tinnitus, but he reportedly caught at least 6 secret romantic liaisons and 2 low-level treasonous whispers during its brief service. You reach a mannequin labeled Project Comet. It's wearing an auburn wig so thick and dense it resembles a bear's winter coat. Beneath the hair is a metal framework designed to hide miniature maps, keys, and, according to one logbook, a shrunken love letter stitched in code. The project was discontinued after a valet fell asleep on the wig, cracking the framework and releasing 3 rolled parchments into the chamber pot. Historians still argue whether these spy wigs were used regularly or simply conceived as paranoia-fueled prototypes during wartime. Some letters from the Ministry of Secrets suggest they were deployed at foreign embassies. Others insist the whole thing was an overfunded fantasy by Louis's paranoid advisors. The lack of consistent documentation only deepens the mystery. Every mention of a spy wig is quickly followed by a warning, a redaction, or a casual lost in fire. You reach a side room where a wig rests on a marble plinth beneath glass. It's titled The Patriot, and woven into its curls are fine gold threads. When viewed under candlelight, they spell out "Le Roi est grand." Meant for close gatherings, the message was never to be spoken, only hinted at during courtesies. You imagine a slow bow, the faint glint of gold, and a message passed through silence that a footnote in one registry suggests wigs were also used for misdirection. A gray powdered style might indicate mourning or disguise a healthy ambassador as a grieving uncle. A shorn-back wig on a woman might suggest illness, concealing the fact that her hair had been sacrificed to create another's more elaborate piece. There's even evidence of wigs scented with subtle poison, clove oil laced with belladonna, released during intimate embraces. The target wouldn't die, just grow feverish, then delirious. Too sick to attend council. Mission accomplished. You move to a chest labeled Ciphers and Locks. Inside are wigs fitted with clasps that release when tugged a certain way. One includes a tiny scroll cylinder hidden under a detachable braid. Another has a false scalp that lifts, revealing a wax-sealed letter slot. There's even a blonde piece that buzzes when exposed to fire, an early smoke detection gag created for a famously paranoid marquis. The steward wrote, "Works. Woke up the dog." And then there's the Firebird, the ugliest wig in the room. It looks like a pigeon exploded on top of a raccoon. It's made of rooster feathers, black lace, and brass wire shaped like a lightning bolt. But according to notes, this was the decoy. Its wearer could pass undetected because nobody believed anyone of real rank would wear something so hideous. While everyone laughed at him, his actual mission, delivering state funds to a rebel duchess, succeeded without a hitch. It dawns on you how serious Versailles was about spectacle and how easily it blurred into subterfuge. Every wig you've seen had more than one purpose: to elevate, disguise, distract, mislead. In this vault of follicular espionage, you realize Louis XIV's court was not just powdered and perfumed, it was booby-trapped. One final note is pinned to the back of a door. It's handwritten, faded, and unsigned. It reads, "All hair tells a story. Some lie, some whisper, some scream when you pull the right thread." That's when the steward returns and gestures upward. No more secrets tonight. It's time to climb back into the light. You dust powdered hair from your sleeves, step into your slippers, and prepare to rejoin the parade upstairs. Just as you ascend, you catch a glimpse of your reflection in a silvered wig-form mirror. For a moment, your own hair looks suspiciously voluminous. You pat it down, just in case. You emerge from the underworld of wigs, blinking and squinting, back into the brightness of Versailles. Above, the chandeliers drip with candlelight, and the salon buzzes faintly with the murmurs of gossip, flirtation, and the clink of porcelain teacups. But something feels different now. You've seen beneath the curls, literally. And now every powdered head you pass seems potentially armed. The palace corridors stretch before you, and the air thickens again with perfume and starch. You veer right, through an antechamber lined with gold-framed portraits of Louis XIV. They're all flattering. Him as a young man, a god, a general, a shepherd, and yes, even as Apollo himself, sun bursting behind his crown of rays. Mainstream historical fact: Louis XIV wasn't just a man obsessed with wigs. He was obsessed with image, and that extended to every square inch of Versailles. Art, architecture, clothing, even hairstyles were shaped by his obsession with central control. Louis knew that beauty was power, and wigs were part of a total aesthetic domination strategy. To be fashionable in Versailles wasn't just vanity. It was a form of political submission. To wear the wrong wig? A social death sentence. To wear the right one? Instant elevation. You slip into the corner of a powder room where a stylist stands adjusting a noble's coif with tiny silver tongs heated over a candle flame. The noble winces, but doesn't protest. This is what prestige smells like: burnt hair and clove oil. Now, you may be wondering, how did Louis manage all this? 40 wigmakers, hundreds of nobles, and not a single powdered strand out of place. The answer lies in the final piece of this follicular empire, the registry of hair. That's right, a literal ledger. Bound in oxblood leather and rumored to weigh more than a small dog, the registry of hair listed not only which wigs were commissioned and when, but who wore them, why, and how they ranked in the court's visual hierarchy. Every noble had an assigned hair profile, signed off by the master coiffeur General Du Roy. If you wanted to change your look, you needed approval. Quirky tidbit: the registry also logged wig incidents. Examples include collapse of curls during outdoor hunt, accidental twinning with rival duchess, and one particularly scandalous entry: Baron's wig flew into soup. Ambassador offended. The official ruling? The Baron was banned from soup proximity for a month and required to wear a low-volume style until further notice. Historians still argue whether the registry of hair was ever actually enforced as harshly as legend suggests. Some scholars believe it was symbolic, more of a social script than a rulebook. Others insist it had real teeth, with sanctioned wig auditors who inspected nobles before entering court functions. One even claims a wig embargo once took down an entire minor noble house after a disputed updo appeared without clearance. You stroll down a hall of mirrors, your slippered feet silent on the parquet floor, passing rows of gilded sconces and, fittingly, wig busts of past favorites. There's the Comtesse de Soubise, whose hairstyle once required a scaffolding frame and 24 straight hours to assemble. Next to her, the Chevalier de Mirepoix, famous not for his battlefield record, but for crafting a wig that resembled a bouquet of carrots and tulips. It was a hit at the garden banquet of 1686. And here's the kicker. Some wigs weren't just for court appearances. They were coded invitations, messages, declarations. Want to signal that your daughter was ready to marry? The matching wig set, mother and daughter in pearl-sprinkled spiral buns, said it all. Mourning, a matte black powdered style with uncurled ends. Celebrating a military victory, add miniature cannons and a plume. There was even a brief fashion for political wigs. One noble wore a tiny model of the Bastille atop his head in a somewhat misguided gesture of loyalty. You can't help but admire the absurd genius of it all. Versailles was a place where nothing was casual. Everything you wore, from your shoes to your eyelashes, was a coded message. And if you wore hair on your head that the king himself had not sanctioned, or worse, hadn't noticed, you were effectively invisible. At the far end of the corridor, a panel in the wall creaks open, revealing a hidden nook. You step inside and find a long bench facing a mirror, dimly lit by oil lamps. Upon the bench sits a velvet cushion, and atop it a wig. But not just any wig. This is the king's wig. Its base is white, powdered and curled, but the top fans out in golden blonde rays, styled to echo the sun itself. The curls shimmer faintly with powdered gold. The tips are kissed with a honey hue. It's ridiculous, theatrical, impractical, and utterly majestic. This was the ceremonial piece. Worn only during the most important appearances, coronations, diplomatic summits, and the opening of court season. It weighed over 10 pounds. One steward had to carry it separately on a velvet pillow and follow Louis like a page boy, just in case he needed to swap styles mid-audience. It even had a nickname, Le Soleil Couronne. The crowned sun. You stare at it for a long time, imagining what it must have been like to wear that monument on your head. Your spine locked straight, your scalp begging for mercy, and every courtier in the room secretly hoping you'd sneeze and knock it off your head. And yet, no one did. Because in Versailles, wigs were more than hair. They were identity, politics, theater, and armor. They weren't just worn. They were wielded. Back out in the corridors of Versailles, the night settles softly through leaded windows, casting moonlight across the parquet floor. You wander slowly now, almost dreamlike, through the halls you've come to know more intimately than you ever intended. Every echo of a footstep calls back some powdered ghost. Every rustle of brocade from another room hints at a silent rivalry, woven through wigs. You step lightly through a service hallway now, ducking beneath low archways. This is the quieter side of court, the backstage of opulence. And here, just beyond the watchful eyes of marble busts and court portraits, you find it. The royal wigmaker's private studio. It's a narrow room, paneled in pale wood, lit by a cluster of beeswax candles whose scent battles valiantly against the ever-present odor of singed hair. Every surface is covered, wigs on stands, bundles of horsehair, jars of powder tinted with violet or ash, curling rods, pomade tins, combs made of bone and mother of pearl. Some tools are familiar. Others look like they belong more in a surgeon's kit than a hairdresser's. And there, hanging on the wall like sacred relics, diagrams of wigs. Blueprints, if you like. Every curl mapped, each layer numbered. One style is labeled Cascade Mercale, another Montaigne de Petals. There's even a ridiculous but charming draft called the Shipwreck, where sails made of lace billow between curls, a hairstyle commissioned to celebrate a naval victory. Apparently, it came with a little fabric anchor that dangled from the side like a charm. Mainstream historical fact. Many of these extravagant wigs weren't just decorative. They were full-on sculptural feats that incorporated wire armatures, cotton batting, and padding made from cork or wool. That's right. You weren't just wearing hair. You were strapping a top-heavy, semi-engineered contraption to your skull and pretending to be totally fine with it while someone tried to court you with a fan. And then there's the matter of pests. Quirky tidbit. These towering wigs often became homes for uninvited guests, lice, mites, and the occasional mouse. Enter the wig scratcher, a small, elegantly carved stick made of ivory or whalebone that allowed the wearer to subtly reach up under their wig and scratch without ever breaking eye contact or decorum. Think of it as a covert itching wand. Ladies would carry them in their chatelaines. Gentlemen tucked them into inner pockets. So the next time someone at a ball was deeply engaged in conversation while repeatedly poking at their temple, chances are they weren't that fascinated by your story. You spot one now on the Wigmakers table, slender, curled at the end like a shepherd's crook. The silent, elegant solution to a crawling reality. Historians still argue whether these pest stories are slightly overblown, product of anti-French caricature and British satire, or if they reflect a genuine hygiene problem beneath the powdered glamour. Some records suggest weekly inspections and regular wig maintenance, while others describe the court as a scratchy, sneezy circus of parasites disguised in taffeta. One truth likely lives between. For every pristine, lavender-scented coiffure, there was a rogue rat nibbling the hem of fashion. You glance now at the wigmaker's workbench, where a head form rests, wooden, faceless, crowned with half-finished curls. The tools beside it are ghostly echoes of craft and performance. The silence in the room is thick with the ghosts of whispered orders and panicked repairs. Imagine it, a duchess running in, breathless. The countess is wearing spiral cones. I need swans. Build me swans by sunset. And they did to as the candles burn lower. Your eyes settle on a thin-bound volume lying open near the mirror. It's a ledger, not the grand registry of hair, but a private log, a journal, perhaps. You trace a finger along the faded ink. Tuesday, Her Majesty demanded less powder. Courtiers followed. Tomorrow the court shall sneeze less. Friday, 14 requests 4 hearts in bloom wig. Red velvet shortage impending. Sunday, new apprentice scorched a client's fringe. Client blamed the wind. You smile. This quiet book, is what makes the history of wigs so utterly human. It's not just Louis XIV and his solar megalomania. It's the artisans, the trends, the fads and fumbles. It's the pettiness, the panic over who wore what, the powdered lies, the scratched sticks. You leave the studio quietly, letting the door fall shut behind you with a soft click. Down the long gallery, you catch your reflection in one of the vast mirrors. Your hair, whatever it looks like tonight, seems suddenly humble, honest, and you wonder what wig the master coiffeur would assign to you. Were you dragged into that powdered orbit? Probably something with humor tucked into the back curl. Maybe a nod to rebellion in a single strand left loose as Versailles slips behind you, and the soft wind rustles the leaves outside the orangery. You feel it, the last of the powdered fog lifting. You've walked through layers of ambition and absurdity, through vanity and ingenuity, and now it's time to let your mind settle, because there's nothing left to know tonight. The wigs have been combed, the curls cooled, and the registry, well, it's gone quiet.